My name is Amanda Foster, and this is the story of how my husband's secretary made the biggest mistake of her career when she decided to humiliate me at a company party. She called me the old model, right to my face, thinking she was untouchable, because she had my husband wrapped around her perfectly manicured finger. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just Kevin's wife. I was about to become her new boss's boss, and karma was about to serve her a reality check she'd never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The look on her face when she realized who I really was? Priceless. But that moment of reckoning was just the beginning of a story that would change everything about my marriage, my career, and my understanding of my own worth. It all started on what should have been a celebration. Kevin had been promoted to senior project manager at Pacific Architecture Group, and they were throwing a company party at the Harbor View Hotel downtown. I had spent weeks looking forward to this evening, proud of my husband's achievement and excited to meet his colleagues. We'd been married for 6 years, and while Kevin often talked about work, I rarely got to put faces to the names he mentioned, over dinner. I chose my outfit carefully that Friday evening, a midnight blue cocktail dress that complemented my auburn hair and brought out my green eyes. Kevin had always said I looked stunning in blue, though lately his compliments had become fewer and farther between. I attributed it to work stress and the demands of his new position. After all, success required sacrifice, and I was willing to support him through the challenging transition. The Harbor View Hotel's ballroom was elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. String lights created a warm ambiance, and the soft jazz music provided the perfect backdrop for conversation. Kevin had arrived earlier to help with setup, so I walked in alone, scanning the crowd for his familiar face among the architects, engineers, and support staff, mingling with drinks in hand. I spotted him near the bar, engaged in animated conversation, with a group of colleagues. Even from across the room, I could see the confidence in his posture, the way he commanded attention when he spoke. It was one of the things that had drawn me to him when we met 7 years ago at a mutual friend's housewarming party. Kevin had this magnetic quality, a natural charisma that made people want to listen to him. As I made my way toward him, weaving through clusters of conversations and laughter, I noticed a young woman standing slightly apart from Kevin's group. She was striking, probably in her mid-20s, with platinum blonde hair styled in perfect waves and wearing a form-fitting red dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Something about her posture, the way she kept glancing at Kevin with a possessive familiarity, made my steps slow. When Kevin finally noticed me approaching, his smile seemed forced, almost uncomfortable. He quickly excused himself from his conversation and met me halfway across the room. "Amanda, you made it," he said, his voice carrying a note I couldn't quite identify. "You look nice." Nice. After 6 years of marriage, after spending an hour getting ready for his celebration, I looked nice. Not beautiful, not stunning, just nice. I pushed down the sting of disappointment and smiled. "Congratulations again on the promotion," I said, adjusting his tie slightly. It was a gesture of affection I'd performed countless times, but tonight he seemed to stiffen under my touch. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks," he replied, glancing over his shoulder toward the group he'd just left. "Listen, there are some people I should introduce you to. Important clients and colleagues." For the next hour, Kevin paraded me around, the room like a prop in his professional performance. His introductions were perfunctory, lacking the warmth and pride I'd expected. "This is my wife, Amanda," he'd say, then immediately pivot the conversation back to work topics that excluded me entirely. I found myself standing beside him like an accessory, smiling politely while feeling increasingly invisible. It was during one of these introductions that I first heard her laugh. It was distinctive, bright, and musical, cutting through the ambient noise of the party. I turned toward the sound and saw the blonde woman from earlier, now surrounded by a small group of admirers. She was telling some story that had them all captivated, her gestures animated and confident. "Who's that?" I asked Kevin quietly, nodding in her direction. "Stephanie Blake," he replied without looking. "She's my secretary. Very efficient." There was something in the way he said her name, a subtle softness that made my chest tighten with an unidentifiable unease. I studied Stephanie more carefully, noting how she seemed to glow under the attention, how her eyes periodically swept the room as if checking to see who was watching her performance. "She seems young," I observed. "She's 26, Kevin said, then added quickly, "but very mature for her age, really understands the business." Before I could respond, a colleague pulled Kevin into another conversation about construction deadlines and permit delays. I excused myself to get a drink, needing a moment to process the strange undercurrent I was sensing but couldn't quite name. At the bar, I ordered a glass of wine and found myself positioned with a clear view of Stephanie's group. She was holding court, her confidence magnetic in a way that reminded me of Kevin himself. As I watched, she excused herself from her admirers and walked directly toward where Kevin was standing with his back to her. What happened next unfolded like a slow-motion movie scene. Stephanie approached Kevin from behind and placed her hand on his shoulder, a gesture that seemed far too intimate for a secretary addressing her boss at a professional function. Kevin didn't startle or step away. Instead, he turned with a smile that I hadn't seen directed at me in months, warm and genuine and completely unguarded. They spoke quietly for a moment, heads close together, and I watched Kevin's expression transform. The tension I'd noticed in his shoulders all evening melted away, replaced by an ease and comfort that made my stomach drop. This wasn't the interaction between a boss and his efficient secretary. This was something else entirely. I was so focused on their exchange that I didn't notice someone approaching until a voice beside me said, "Beautiful couple, aren't they?" I turned to find an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, holding a martini and following my gaze toward Kevin and Stephanie. "I'm sorry?" I said, confused. "Kevin and Stephanie," she clarified. "They make such a lovely pair. The way they complement each other, you can just tell they're perfectly matched." My wine glass nearly slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I managed to say. "Kevin is my husband." The woman's eyes widened in shock, her face flushing crimson. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. It's just that they seemed so—" She paused, clearly flustered. "So connected. I naturally assumed." She hurried away, leaving me standing at the bar with my world tilting on its axis. A stranger at my husband's company party had assumed he was coupled with his secretary. The implications of that assumption crashed over me like a cold wave. I set my wine down with shaking hands and forced myself to look back at Kevin and Stephanie. Now that the possibility had been planted in my mind, their body language seemed glaringly obvious. The way she touched his arm when she laughed, how he leaned in when she spoke, giving her his complete attention. The private smiles they shared, that excluded everyone else around them. How long had this been going on? How could I have been so blind? As if sensing my scrutiny, Stephanie's gaze swept across the room and landed on me. For a moment, our eyes met directly, and I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, perhaps? Or assessment? Then her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and she said something to Kevin that made him glance in my direction. The guilt that flashed across his face lasted only a second before he schooled his expression into careful neutrality. But it was enough. In that instant, I knew with absolute certainty that my marriage was not what I had believed it to be. Stephanie whispered something else to Kevin, and then she was walking toward me, her red dress swaying with each confident step. My pulse quickened as she approached, every instinct telling me to prepare for something unpleasant. "You must be Amanda," she said when she reached me, extending a perfectly manicured hand. Her voice was as polished as her appearance, with a subtle undertone that I couldn't quite identify. "I'm Stephanie Blake, Kevin's secretary." "Nice to meet you," I replied, shaking her hand briefly. Her grip was firm, almost challenging. "Kevin talks about you sometimes," she continued, her smile sharp around the edges. "Though I have to say, you're not quite what I expected." There was something pointed in her tone that made my defenses rise. "What did you expect?" Stephanie's laugh was light and dismissive. "Oh, you know how it is. When someone talks about their college sweetheart, you picture someone more contemporary, someone who's kept up with the times." The words hit like small, precise cuts. College sweetheart. As if our relationship were some outdated relic from a bygone era, rather than a marriage built over years of shared experiences and mutual support. "I see," I said carefully, determined not to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "Don't get me wrong," Stephanie continued, her voice dropping to a tone that might have sounded concerned to anyone overhearing. "There's something charming about the classic look. Very retro. It's just that in Kevin's position, with all the networking and client entertainment he has to do, it helps to have someone who really understands the modern professional world." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Each word was carefully chosen, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. She was calling me outdated, unfashionable, unsuitable for Kevin's new status, all while pretending to make conversation. "Kevin seems to value loyalty and substance over appearances," I replied, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "Oh, absolutely," Stephanie agreed with false enthusiasm. "Loyalty is so important, though sometimes you have to wonder if holding on to something just because it's familiar is really the best choice for everyone involved." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering what was clearly intended as the final blow. "I mean, nobody wants to be driving around in an old model when there are so many exciting new options available." The metaphor was crude and intentional. She was comparing me to an outdated car, something to be traded in for a newer, better version. The audacity of it, standing at my husband's company party and telling me to my face that I was obsolete, left me momentarily speechless. Stephanie seemed to take my silence as victory. Her smile became genuine for the first time since she'd approached me, triumphant and cruel. "Well, I should get back to the party," she said, glancing toward where Kevin was watching our interaction with obvious tension. "It was so nice to finally meet you, Amanda. Kevin's told me so much about you." She turned to walk away, then paused as if remembering something. "Oh, and Kevin mentioned you work somewhere downtown too. Some kind of marketing job? That's sweet. It must be nice to have a little career to keep you busy." A little career. The condescension in her voice made my teeth clench. If she only knew. As Stephanie sauntered back toward Kevin, hips swaying with theatrical confidence, I remained at the bar, processing what had just happened. The woman was sleeping with my husband. That much was clear from her proprietary attitude and the intimate familiarity I'd witnessed between them. But more than that, she felt secure enough in her position to openly insult me, to essentially tell me that my marriage was over and she was the replacement model. The humiliation burned in my chest, but underneath it, a different emotion was taking root. Cold, calculating anger. Stephanie Blake had just made a very serious miscalculation. She thought she knew who she was dealing with, thought she could dismiss me as some suburban housewife with a little career who would quietly step aside when faced with superior competition. What she didn't know was that my little career had just gotten significantly more interesting. What she didn't know was that in exactly 10 days, I would be walking into my new office as the senior marketing director for Sterling Marketing Solutions. the firm that had just won the contract to handle all of Pacific Architecture Group's marketing and branding needs. What she didn't know was that she had just insulted her new boss's boss, and I had a very long memory for insults. I finished my wine slowly, watching Kevin and Stephanie resume their intimate conversation across the room. They looked comfortable, together, natural in a way that Kevin and I hadn't been in months. The pain of that realization was sharp and immediate, but I forced myself to think past the emotional devastation to the practical implications. My marriage was over. I had suspected it for weeks, but tonight had provided confirmation in the most humiliating way possible. Kevin had not only betrayed our vows, but had allowed his mistress to insult me at his professional function, secure in the knowledge that he wouldn't object. But Kevin and Stephanie had underestimated me in ways that would soon become apparent. They thought they had all the power in this situation, that I was some helpless victim who would crumble under pressure and quietly disappear from their lives. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I set my empty glass on the bar and walked back into the party, my spine straight and my head high. When Kevin glanced my way, I gave him a serene smile and rejoined the conversation he was having with a group of junior architects. For the rest of the evening, I played the role of the supportive wife perfectly, charming his colleagues and making appropriate small talk while my mind worked furiously behind my polite facade. Stephanie watched our interactions with visible confusion, clearly having expected me to flee in tears or create a scene. Instead, I was gracious and engaging, complimenting her dress when we passed each other and thanking her for keeping Kevin so well organized at work. By the time we left the party 3 hours later, I could see the frustration in Stephanie's eyes. Her psychological warfare hadn't achieved the desired effect, and she couldn't understand why. In the car ride home, Kevin was unusually quiet, stealing glances at me when he thought I wasn't looking. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You seem to enjoy yourself tonight," he said carefully. "I did," I replied honestly. "Your colleagues are lovely, especially Stephanie. Such a charming young woman." Kevin's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "She can be a bit intense sometimes." "Oh, I didn't find her intense at all," I said, my voice light and conversational. "Very confident, though. I admire confidence in young women. It will serve her well in her career." The rest of the drive passed in silence, but I could feel Kevin's tension radiating through the space between us. He knew something had shifted tonight, but he couldn't identify exactly what. When we arrived, home at our modest but comfortable house in the Riverside district, I went through my normal evening routine with mechanical precision. Hung up my dress, removed my makeup, brushed my teeth. Kevin hovered nearby, clearly wanting to say something, but lacking the courage to broach whatever subject was weighing on his mind. "Good night," I said finally, kissing his cheek with the same perfunctory affection I'd shown for weeks. "Good night," he replied, relief evident in his voice that I wasn't going to confront him about whatever he thought I might have observed. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Kevin fell asleep beside me, I wasn't thinking about confrontations. I was thinking about strategy. I was thinking about the corporate reorganization meeting I had on Monday morning, where I would be officially introduced as Sterling Marketing Solutions' new senior marketing director. I was thinking about the Pacific Architecture Group account that would be my first major project, and I was thinking about Stephanie Blake, who had called me the old model and dismissed my career as a cute little hobby, having no idea that she had just declared war on someone who was about to have considerable power over her professional future. Karma, I reflected as sleep finally claimed me, had a beautiful sense of timing. And in 10 days, it was going to knock on Stephanie Blake's door with my signature on the paperwork. The best part? She would never see it coming. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Portland weather that matched my contemplative mood. I had spent the weekend in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of normal married life while mentally preparing for the seismic shifts that were about to occur in every aspect of my existence. Kevin had been unusually attentive over the weekend, bringing me coffee in bed and suggesting we go out for dinner Saturday night. I recognized the gestures for what they were: guilt-motivated overtures from a man who suspected his wife might have seen something at the company party but wasn't certain what or how much. I accepted his offerings with the same gracious detachment I'd maintained since Friday night, neither warm enough to reassure him nor cold enough to confirm his fears. Let him wonder. Let him worry. After 6 years of marriage, he should have known me well enough to recognize that my calm was far more dangerous than any storm. This morning, however, was about my future, not my past. I dressed with particular care, selecting a charcoal gray suit that conveyed both authority and understated elegance. The woman who looked back at me from the mirror was polished, professional, and ready to claim her place in the corporate hierarchy that Stephanie Blake had so dismissively relegated me from. Sterling Marketing Solutions occupied 3 floors of a sleek glass building in downtown Portland, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city and the mountains beyond. I had visited the offices twice during the interview process, but walking in as an employee felt different, weighted with possibility and purpose. The receptionist, a friendly woman named Carol with silver-streaked hair and a warm smile, greeted me with obvious pleasure. "Ms. Foster, welcome to your first day. Mr. Hamilton is expecting you in the executive conference room at 9:30 for the team introduction meeting." Richard Hamilton, the company's CEO, was a man in his late 50s with the kind of easy confidence that came from decades of successful leadership. He had recruited me personally after my previous company's marketing campaign for a major retail chain had won 3 industry awards. During the interview process, he'd made it clear that Sterling was expanding aggressively and needed seasoned professionals who could handle high-profile accounts with minimal supervision. The executive conference room was already populated when I arrived, 10 people seated around a polished mahogany table that reflected the city light streaming through the windows. Some faces were familiar from my interviews, others were new, but all turned toward me with the mixture of curiosity and assessment that accompanied any new hire at the senior level. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Amanda Foster, our new senior marketing director," Hamilton announced, gesturing for me to take the empty chair to his right. Amanda comes to us from Morrison & Associates, where she spearheaded the Cascade retail campaign that swept the regional advertising awards last year. Polite applause accompanied the murmurs of welcome as I settled into my chair. Hamilton continued. With brief introductions around the table, department heads and project managers who would be my colleagues, and, in some cases, my direct reports. "Now," Hamilton said, opening a leather portfolio, "let's discuss our newest major account acquisition. Pacific Architecture Group has selected Sterling to handle all their marketing and branding needs, effective immediately. This is a significant win for us, a 3-year contract worth approximately $2 million annually." I kept my expression carefully neutral, though inside I felt a surge of satisfaction so intense it was almost dizzying. Pacific Architecture Group, Kevin's company, Stephanie's workplace. "The account will be handled by our new senior marketing director," Hamilton continued, turning to me with a smile. "Amanda, this will be your primary focus for the first quarter. Pacific Architecture Group is expanding rapidly, opening new offices in Seattle and San Francisco, and they need a comprehensive marketing strategy to support that growth." "I'm looking forward to the challenge," I replied, my voice steady and professional. "When do we begin client meetings?" "Next Monday," Hamilton said, consulting his notes. "We'll be meeting with their executive team, including the president, the head of business development, and several department managers. I understand they're bringing some support staff as well to ensure smooth communication between our teams." Support staff, like secretaries perhaps. The rest of the meeting focused on other accounts and administrative details. but I found it difficult to concentrate fully. My mind kept returning to the image of Stephanie Blake's face when she realized that the old model she had so contemptuously dismissed was now in a position to influence her professional life in ways she couldn't imagine. After the meeting concluded, Hamilton asked me to stay behind for a brief private conversation. "Amanda, I want you to know how pleased we are to have you on board," he said once the room had emptied. "The Pacific Architecture Group account is crucial for Sterling's growth trajectory, and I'm confident you're the right person to handle it." "Thank you for the opportunity," I replied. "I've already begun researching their current marketing materials and brand positioning. I should have a preliminary assessment ready by Wednesday." Hamilton nodded approvingly. "Excellent. There is one thing I should mention about this account. Pacific Architecture Group specifically requested that all marketing decisions go through a single point of contact on their end. They want to avoid the confusion that can arise when multiple people have input on creative direction." "That makes sense," I agreed. "Who's their designated contact?" "A senior project manager named Kevin Foster. Apparently, he's recently been promoted, and they want him to gain experience in client relationship management." The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. Kevin would be my primary point of contact on the account. My husband, who had been emotionally distant for months while conducting an affair with his secretary, would now be answerable to me in a professional capacity. "I'm sure we'll work well together," I said, managing to keep any trace of personal satisfaction from my voice. Hamilton smiled. "I have a good feeling about this partnership. Pacific Architecture Group is exactly the kind of prestigious client that can elevate Sterling's profile in the market." As I walked to my new office later that morning, I marveled at how quickly circumstances could shift. A week ago, I had been the ignored wife at a company party, subjected to insults from my husband's mistress. Today, I was settling into a corner office with a view of the river and the authority to make decisions that would directly impact both Kevin's and Stephanie's professional lives. My office was spacious and well-appointed, with a glass desk, comfortable seating area, and walls lined with built-in bookshelves. Someone had arranged for fresh flowers to be placed on the credenza, a welcoming touch that made the space feel immediately comfortable. I spent the morning reviewing files on Pacific Architecture Group, studying their current marketing materials, and analyzing their brand presence across various media platforms. Their materials were competent but uninspired, exactly the kind of corporate mediocrity that could be transformed with the right creative vision and strategic approach. More importantly, I studied their organizational chart and employee directory. Kevin was listed as Senior Project Manager, reporting to the Director of Operations. Stephanie Blake was listed as Administrative Assistant, Project Management Division. Her photograph in the company directory showed the same confident smile she'd worn while insulting me at the party. By lunchtime, I had developed the preliminary framework for a comprehensive rebranding strategy that would position Pacific Architecture Group as a forward-thinking firm capable of handling complex urban development projects. It was exactly the kind of innovative approach that would require extensive collaboration between our teams, multiple meetings, and careful oversight of implementation. It would also require that Kevin and Stephanie work very closely with me over the coming months. The thought brought me more satisfaction than it probably should have. But I reasoned that professional success was the best revenge. I wasn't planning anything vindictive or unethical. I was simply going to be very, very good at my job, and my job happened to involve managing people who had treated me with shocking disrespect. That evening, I arrived home to find Kevin already in the kitchen, attempting to prepare dinner. This was unusual, since his long hours at the office typically meant I handled most domestic responsibilities. "You're home early," I observed, setting my briefcase by the door. "Thought I'd surprise you," he said, not meeting my eyes as he stirred something on the stove. "How was your first day at the new job?" "Excellent," I replied honestly. "Very Promising. It looks like I'll be handling some significant accounts right from the start. Kevin glanced up sharply. Really? That's unusual for someone just starting at a new company. Sterling hired me specifically for my experience with high-profile clients, I explained, accepting the glass of wine he offered. They have some major contracts that need immediate attention. Anyone I might know? Kevin asked, his tone casual but his body language tense. I took a sip of wine, studying his face over the rim of the glass. Possibly. I'll be working with several architectural firms around the city. The industry is smaller than you might think. Kevin's stirring became more vigorous, and I could see him working through the implications of what I'd said. Portland's architectural community was indeed small and interconnected. It was entirely possible that our professional paths might cross. Well, congratulations on landing such an important role, he said finally. I'm proud of you. The words rang hollow, delivered with the same perfunctory tone he'd used when introducing me at the party. But I accepted them graciously, playing the role of the appreciative wife while mentally cataloging every false note in his performance. Over dinner, Kevin made conversation about his own work, carefully avoiding any mention of his secretary or the dynamics I'd observed at the company party. I listened with apparent interest, asking questions about projects and deadlines while privately noting how much more animated he became when discussing certain aspects of his job. Stephanie's been incredibly helpful with the transition to my new position, he mentioned at one point, then quickly added, all the administrative staff have been supportive, actually. There it was, the guilty overcompensation that confirmed everything I suspected. Kevin was sleeping with his secretary, felt terrible about it, but lacked the courage to either end the affair or end our marriage. Instead, he was trying to manage both relationships simultaneously, a strategy that was destined to fail spectacularly. That's wonderful, I replied warmly. Good administrative support makes such a difference in a demanding job. Kevin looked relieved that I didn't seem bothered by his mention of Stephanie. If only he knew what I was really thinking. After dinner, I retreated to our home office to prepare for the next day's meetings, leaving Kevin to his guilty conscience and whatever internal justifications he was constructing for his behavior. The spare bedroom had been converted into a small office space where I could work from home when necessary, complete with a desk, filing cabinets, and a comfortable reading chair. I settled at the desk with my laptop and began drafting a comprehensive marketing proposal for Pacific Architecture Group. The work was absorbing, requiring all my creative and analytical skills, and I found myself energized in a way I hadn't felt in months. This was what I was good at, what I had trained for through years of education and experience. Creating compelling narratives around corporate brands, identifying market opportunities, developing strategies that transformed how companies presented themselves to the world. It was challenging, intellectually stimulating work that utilized every aspect of my professional expertise. As I worked late into the evening, refining concepts and polishing presentations, I felt a clarity of purpose that had been missing from my life for far too long. My marriage might be ending, but my career was entering its most exciting phase. And in exactly 6 days, I would walk into a conference room at Pacific Architecture Group and watch Stephanie Blake's face when she realized that the old model she had so thoroughly dismissed was now in a position to evaluate her performance, her professionalism, and her future with the company. The anticipation was almost as energizing as the work itself. Friday afternoon found me putting the finishing touches on my presentation for Pacific Architecture Group, a comprehensive 60-slide deck that outlined everything from brand positioning to digital marketing strategies. It was thorough, innovative, and exactly the kind of high-level thinking that justified Sterling's premium fees. My phone buzzed with a text message from Nicole Rodriguez, my best friend since college, and the one person who knew all the details of my deteriorating marriage. Drinks tonight? You've been radio silent all week and I'm worried. I smiled, typing back quickly. Rain check? Big presentation Monday, and I want it to be perfect. This is about Kevin, isn't it? What happened at that party? Nicole had an uncanny ability to read between the lines of even my most carefully worded communications. It was a skill that served her well in her role as a corporate attorney, but sometimes made it difficult to keep personal matters private. Nothing I can't handle, I replied. We'll call you this weekend. Amanda Foster, don't you dare shut me out. I'm coming over. Before I could respond, she had already texted Kevin directly, something she'd done countless times over the years when she wanted to coordinate social plans. Kevin and Nicole had a friendly but somewhat wary relationship, largely because Nicole had never bothered to hide her opinion that Kevin took me for granted. An hour later, Nicole appeared at my office door with 2 cups of coffee from the lobby, cafe, and a determined expression on her face. Start talking, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. And don't try to tell me everything's fine. I've known you for 15 years. Nicole was a force of nature, barely 5 feet tall, but with the commanding presence of someone much larger. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun that somehow managed to look both professional and elegant, and her sharp business suit suggested she'd come directly from court or a client meeting. It's complicated, I began, but Nicole cut me off with a dismissive wave. Everything interesting is complicated. Details, please. So I told her. About the party, about Stephanie Blake's calculated insults, about Kevin's obvious infidelity, and my new position at Sterling, about the Pacific Architecture Group account and the delicious irony of my professional situation. Nicole listened, without interruption, her expression growing more incredulous with each revelation. Let me see if I understand this correctly, she said finally. Kevin's secretary called you an old model, basically told you to step aside for the newer version, and now you're about to become her boss? Effectively, yes. And Kevin doesn't know about your new job? He knows I started at Sterling, but he doesn't know about the Pacific Architecture Group account. Nicole leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. Amanda, this is perfect. Absolutely perfect. I'm not looking for revenge, I protested. I just want to do my job well. Of course you do. And doing your job well in this case means ensuring that Pacific Architecture Group receives the highest possible level of professional service, which naturally requires working closely with their staff to evaluate current processes and identify areas for improvement. There was something in Nicole's tone that made me suspicious. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Stephanie Blake is about to learn a very valuable lesson about professional conduct and the importance of treating people with respect, regardless of their perceived status. Nicole? What? You said yourself that she was inappropriate at the company party. As someone with oversight responsibilities for this account, it's perfectly reasonable for you to assess whether all team members are conducting themselves in a manner that reflects well on their company. She had a point, though I wasn't entirely comfortable with the direction her thoughts were heading. I don't want to do anything unethical, I said firmly. There's nothing unethical about maintaining professional standards, Nicole replied, and there's definitely nothing unethical about documenting inappropriate behavior when you witness it. We talked for another hour, with Nicole asking detailed questions about Sterling's protocols and the scope of my authority as senior marketing director. By the time she left, I felt more confident about Monday's presentation and more aware of the various ways my new position could impact the people who had treated me so dismissively. That weekend, I threw myself into final preparations for the Pacific Architecture Group meeting. I rehearsed my presentation until I could deliver it flawlessly, researched each attendee so I could tailor my communication style to their preferences, and selected an outfit that projected exactly the right combination of authority and approachability. Kevin seemed increasingly nervous as Monday approached, though he tried to hide his anxiety behind false cheerfulness and unusual attentiveness. He brought me breakfast in bed Sunday morning, complimented my hair when I came downstairs, and suggested, We spend the afternoon walking through the Pearl District like we used to when we were dating. I accepted his overtures with the same polite detachment I'd maintained all week, neither encouraging nor discouraging his sudden interest in being a more attentive husband. Part of me wondered if his guilt was finally overwhelming his desire for his secretary, but I suspected his behavior had more to do with general anxiety about his professional situation than any genuine remorse about our marriage. Sunday evening, as I laid out my clothes for the next day and made final adjustments to my presentation materials, Kevin hovered in the bedroom doorway like he wanted to say something important. "Is everything okay?" I asked, looking up from my laptop. "I've been thinking about us," he said finally, the words rushed and awkward. "About our marriage. I know I've been distant lately, and I want you to know that it's not about anything you've done wrong." The conversation I'd been expecting for weeks was apparently about to happen, but his timing couldn't have been worse. Tomorrow was the most important day of my professional life, and the last thing I needed was an emotional confrontation with my unfaithful husband. "We can talk about this later," I said gently, "after my big presentation tomorrow." Kevin looked relieved to postpone the conversation, though I suspected he was more concerned about avoiding conflict than respecting my professional priorities. "Of course," he agreed quickly. "I know how important this is for your career." If only he knew how important it was for so many other reasons. Monday morning dawned clear and bright, Portland sunshine streaming through our bedroom windows like a good omen. I woke early, feeling energized and focused in a way that reminded me of my college debate team days, when the anticipation of intellectual competition made my pulse quicken with excitement rather than anxiety. By 7:30, I was dressed and ready, wearing a navy blue suit that conveyed both professionalism and confidence, with my hair styled in a sleek chignon that added an extra touch of sophistication. My presentation materials were organized in a leather portfolio, and I'd printed backup copies of everything in case technology failed at a crucial moment. Kevin was still in the shower when I left the house, calling out a muffled, "Good luck," through the bathroom door. I responded with an appropriately grateful thank you, though luck had very little to do with what was about to happen. The drive to Pacific Architecture Group's offices took me through downtown Portland's business district, past the coffee shops and food carts that gave the city its distinctive character. The Pacific Architecture Group building was a testament to modern design, all clean lines and glass facades that reflected the morning sky like a mirror. I had driven past it countless times over the years, never imagining that I would one day walk through its doors as anything other than Kevin's wife attending a company function. Today was different. Today, I was Amanda Foster, Senior Marketing Director at Sterling Marketing Solutions, and I was here to conduct business. The lobby was spacious and minimalist, with polished concrete floors and abstract sculptures that suggested creativity within corporate structure. The receptionist, a young man with carefully styled hair and an earnest expression, greeted me with professional warmth. "Ms. Foster, I'm Marcus, and I'll be escorting you to the conference room. Mr. Hamilton from Sterling arrived a few minutes ago, and the Pacific Architecture Group team is assembling now." As we walked through corridors lined with architectural drawings and awards, I caught glimpses of the workplace where Kevin spent most of his waking hours. Open-plan workstations were arranged around collaborative spaces, with glass-walled offices for senior staff providing privacy while maintaining visual connection to the larger team. It was a dynamic environment, clearly designed to foster creativity and innovation. I could see why Kevin enjoyed working here, why he'd been energized by his recent promotion. What I couldn't see yet was any sign of either Kevin or Stephanie. The executive conference room was impressive, with a long table that could easily seat 20 people and floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. Richard Hamilton was already seated, reviewing documents with a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, whom I recognized from the company website as Thomas Crawford, Pacific Architecture Group's president. "Amanda, Hamilton said, rising to greet me. Perfect timing. I'd like you to meet Tom Crawford. Crawford's handshake was firm, his smile genuine. Ms. Foster, Richard has told me excellent things about your work. We're looking forward to seeing what Sterling can do for us. Thank you for the opportunity, I replied. I'm excited to share some ideas about how we can elevate Pacific Architecture Group's market presence. Over the next few minutes, other team members filed into the room. The head of business development, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Wells, who asked insightful questions about digital marketing strategies. The director of operations, a soft-spoken man named David Chen, who seemed particularly interested in brand consistency across multiple office locations. And then Kevin walked in. He saw Hamilton first, extending his hand with professional courtesy, as Marcus made introductions. Mr. Foster, our senior project manager, who will be your primary point of contact for this account. It was only when Kevin turned to acknowledge the rest of the Sterling team that his eyes landed on me. The shock that flashed across his face was immediate and unmistakable, quickly followed by confusion, then something that might have been panic. Kevin, I said smoothly, extending my hand as if we were strangers meeting for the first time. I'm Amanda Foster, Senior Marketing Director at Sterling. I'll be leading your account. Kevin's handshake was mechanical, his palm slightly damp, with sudden perspiration. Amanda, he managed, his voice carefully controlled. It's nice to meet you. To everyone else in the room, we were simply two professionals being introduced. Only Kevin and I knew that we were also a married couple who hadn't spoken honestly with each other in months, now thrust into a business relationship that neither of us had anticipated. I understand you'll be my primary contact for this project, I continued, maintaining perfect professional demeanor. I'm looking forward to working with you. Likewise, Kevin replied, though his expression suggested he was looking forward to nothing of the sort. Crawford had been watching this exchange with the mild interest of someone observing routine business interactions, but Hamilton seemed pleased by what he perceived as immediate rapport between his team and the client. Excellent, Hamilton said. Amanda, why don't you begin with your presentation? I think everyone's going to be impressed with what you've prepared. I moved to the front of the room, connecting my laptop to the projection system with movements that felt automatic, despite my heightened awareness of Kevin's presence. He had taken a seat halfway down the table, carefully avoiding direct eye contact while maintaining the appearance of professional attention. Before we begin, I said, addressing the room while my presentation title slide appeared on the wall-mounted screen. I'd like to note that we may have additional support staff joining us later in the meeting. I understand that seamless communication between our teams is a priority, so we want to ensure that everyone who will be involved in implementation is present for the strategic overview. Crawford nodded approvingly. Absolutely. Kevin, did you arrange for Stephanie to join us once her morning meetings are finished? Kevin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She should be here shortly. Perfect. I had been wondering how to ensure Stephanie's presence without seeming to specifically request it. Crawford had just solved that problem for me. Wonderful, I said. In the meantime, let's explore how we can transform Pacific Architecture Group's brand presence in today's competitive market. The next 45 minutes were among the most professionally satisfying of my career. My presentation was polished, comprehensive, and exactly what the client needed to hear. I outlined strategies for digital engagement, proposed innovative approaches to showcase their portfolio, and demonstrated how proper branding could support their expansion into new markets. More importantly, I could see the growing enthusiasm in the room as each slide built upon the previous concepts. Crawford asked thoughtful questions about implementation timelines. Wells wanted details about social media integration. Chen was interested in how the branding would adapt across different geographical markets. Kevin said nothing. He sat perfectly still, taking notes that I suspected he wasn't actually processing, while his colleagues responded with increasing excitement. to proposals that would require extensive collaboration between our teams over the coming months. 20 minutes into my presentation, there was a soft knock on the conference room door. Marcus appeared, followed by a figure that made my pulse quicken with anticipation. Stephanie Blake entered the room like she was walking onto a stage, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled and her red dress commanding attention even in the professional setting. She carried herself with the same confident authority I remembered from the company party, radiating the kind of self-assurance that came from being accustomed to being the most attractive person in any room. "Sorry I'm late," she said, her voice carrying easily across the space. The Henderson project meeting ran longer than expected. Crawford gestured to an empty chair near Kevin. "No problem at all, Stephanie. We're just getting started with Sterling's presentation. This is Amanda Foster, their senior marketing director." Stephanie's gaze swept across the room and landed on me standing at the front with the remote control in my hand. For a moment, her expression remained politely attentive, the look of someone trying to place a familiar face in an unexpected context. Then recognition dawned. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Confidence melted into confusion. Then confusion shifted into something approaching horror as the implications of my presence became clear. The woman who had called me the old model and dismissed my career as a little job was now looking at me standing in front of a room full of her colleagues, clearly in a position of significant professional authority. "Ms. Blake," I said pleasantly, inclining my head in polite acknowledgement. "How nice to see you again." Stephanie's mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged. She sank into the indicated chair with movements that seemed suddenly uncertain, her usual poise evaporating as she tried to process this unexpected development. Kevin, who had been watching her entrance with obvious tension, now looked like he might be physically ill. The color had drained from his face, and I could see him struggling to maintain professional composure while his personal and professional worlds collided in ways he clearly hadn't anticipated. "Now, as I was saying," I continued, returning attention to my presentation as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Effective brand management requires consistent messaging across all client touchpoints. This includes everything from digital presence to in-person interactions with potential customers." I advanced to the next slide, which outlined standards for professional communication and client relations. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was discussing professional behavior while looking directly at a woman who had violated every principle of workplace appropriateness at the company party. At Sterling, we believe that every interaction a client has with your organization contributes to their overall impression of your brand, I explained, making eye contact with each person around the table. This means that everyone from senior executives to administrative staff plays a crucial role in brand representation. Stephanie shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I suspected she was beginning to understand that her behavior at the party might have consequences she hadn't anticipated. The presentation continued smoothly, with Crawford and his team asking increasingly detailed questions about implementation, strategies, and timeline expectations. It was clear that Pacific Architecture Group was prepared to make a significant investment in rebranding, which meant months of collaborative work between our organizations. "The initial phase will require extensive consultation with your team," I explained, advancing to a slide that outlined project milestones. "We'll need to conduct interviews with key personnel to understand current workflows and identify opportunities for improvement." "What kind of interviews?" Wells asked. "Comprehensive assessments of how each department currently handles client communication, brand representation, and marketing activities," I replied. "We'll want to speak with everyone from senior management to support staff to ensure we have a complete picture of your current practices." Kevin's pen had stopped moving across his notepad. Stephanie looked like she was holding her breath. "That makes perfect sense," Crawford said. "Kevin, can you coordinate scheduling for these interviews? I want to make sure Amanda's team has access to whoever they need." Of course, Kevin managed, his voice slightly strained. Excellent, I said. I'll send you a detailed list of interview requirements by the end of the week. We'll want to start with administrative and support staff, since they often have the most direct client contact. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, covering budget considerations, approval processes, and communication protocols. By the time we concluded, Pacific Architecture Group had committed to a comprehensive rebranding initiative that would touch every aspect of their business operations. More importantly for my personal situation, I now had legitimate professional reasons to conduct detailed evaluations of their staff performance, including their administrative personnel. As the meeting wound down and participants began gathering their materials, Crawford approached me with obvious satisfaction. "Amanda, this is exactly what we needed," he said warmly. "I'm impressed by the depth of your analysis and the practicality of your recommendations." "Thank you," I replied. "I'm looking forward to working with your team. Kevin will be your primary point of contact, but please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly if you need anything," Crawford continued. "This project is a priority for us." Kevin had been standing nearby, clearly hoping to speak with me privately, but Crawford's continued presence made personal conversation impossible. Finally, Hamilton suggested that our team schedule a follow-up meeting for later in the week to discuss implementation details. "Perfect," I agreed. "Kevin, shall we say Thursday afternoon? That will give me time to prepare the detailed interview protocols we discussed." "Thursday works," Kevin replied, though his tone suggested he was dreading the prospect. As the meeting broke up and people began filing out of the conference room, Stephanie remained seated, apparently paralyzed by the realization that her professional life had just become significantly more complicated. I was packing my presentation materials when she finally approached, her usual confidence replaced by obvious anxiety. "Amanda," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else was within earshot. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I imagine not," I replied pleasantly, continuing to organize my papers. "About the other night, at the party," she began, then stopped as if unsure how to continue. "What about it?" Stephanie's face flushed slightly. I may have said some things that in retrospect weren't entirely appropriate. "May have?" I did say some things that were inappropriate," she corrected quickly. "I was having a difficult evening, and I took it out on you unfairly." It was a carefully crafted non-apology, the kind of statement designed to acknowledge wrongdoing without accepting full responsibility. Under different circumstances, I might have accepted it and moved on. But these weren't different circumstances. "I appreciate you acknowledging that," I said, closing my portfolio and meeting her eyes directly. Professional behavior is very important in business relationships. The emphasis on professional behavior wasn't subtle, and Stephanie clearly understood the implication. Her face went pale as she realized that her conduct at the party could potentially impact her job security. "I hope we can work together effectively on this project," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "I'm sure we can," I replied, "as long as everyone maintains appropriate professional standards." With that, I excused myself and left the conference room, feeling Stephanie's worried gaze following me down the corridor. In the elevator, Hamilton was practically glowing with satisfaction. "That went even better than I expected," he said. "Crawford was clearly impressed, and I think we're going to have a very successful partnership with Pacific Architecture Group." "I agree," I said, "though I suspect there may be some interesting dynamics to navigate as we get deeper into the project." Hamilton looked curious but didn't press for details. He trusted me to handle client relationships appropriately, and I had no intention of disappointing him. As we rode down to the lobby, I reflected on how much had changed in the space of 2 hours. This morning, Kevin and Stephanie had been secure in their assumption that they could conduct their affair without consequences, confident that I was safely contained in my little career and posed no threat to their plans. Now they both understood that their professional lives would be subject to my oversight for the foreseeable future. The power dynamic that Stephanie had so smugly referenced at the company party had shifted completely, and neither of them quite knew how to process the implications. The best part was that everything I had done was entirely legitimate and professional. I had presented an excellent marketing strategy, secured a valuable client account, and established clear protocols for ongoing collaboration. The fact that these protocols would also allow me to document and address inappropriate workplace behavior was simply a fortunate coincidence. That evening, I arrived home to find Kevin waiting in the living room with a glass of whiskey and an expression of barely controlled anxiety. He stood when I entered, his movements sharp and agitated. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Good evening to you too," I replied, setting my briefcase down and removing my jacket. "How was the rest of your day?" "Amanda, don't play. Games? You know exactly what I'm talking about." I settled into the armchair across from him, noting how his usual confidence had been replaced by obvious discomfort. "I'm not playing games, Kevin. I'm trying to have a normal conversation with my husband about our respective work days." "There's nothing normal about what happened today," he said, beginning to pace. "You didn't tell me you were working on our account." "You didn't ask about the specifics of my new position," I replied calmly. "And even if you had, I'm not sure why it would matter. We're both professionals. Surely we can maintain appropriate business relationships regardless of our personal connection." Kevin stopped pacing and stared at me. "Appropriate business relationships? Amanda, we're married." "Yes, we are," I agreed. "Though I have to say, I've been questioning what that means to you lately." The accusation hung in the air between us, unspoken but clearly understood. Kevin's face went through several expressions before settling on defensive resignation. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that you've been distant for months. Kevin, it means that at your company party last week, your colleagues assumed you were there with your secretary rather than your wife. It means that I've been feeling like a stranger in my own marriage." Kevin sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized as his response to overwhelming stress. "Things have been complicated," he said finally. "Complicated how?" For a moment, I thought he might actually confess to the affair. His mouth opened and closed several times, and I could see him weighing his options. Finally, he seemed to decide that partial honesty was safer than complete disclosure. "The promotion has been more challenging than I expected," he said. "There's been a lot of pressure, long hours, difficult clients. I know I haven't been the best husband lately." It was another carefully crafted deflection, acknowledging problems without addressing their real cause. I wondered if Kevin genuinely believed that work stress explained his behavior, or if he was simply buying time while he figured out how to manage his increasingly complicated situation. "I understand that work can be stressful," I said. "But Kevin, you've barely been present in our marriage for months. We don't talk. We don't spend time together. And when we do interact, you seem to be somewhere else entirely." "I know," he said quietly. "I want to fix that." "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you've already checked out of this relationship." Kevin looked genuinely pained by the accusation, which surprised me. If he was planning to leave our marriage for Stephanie, why would my emotional distance bother him? "That's not true," he insisted. "I love you, Amanda. I know I haven't been showing it lately, but you're the most important thing in my life." The words rang hollow, delivered with the kind of desperate sincerity that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "Then why does it feel like I'm competing for your attention with everything else in your life?" I asked. "You're not competing with anything," Kevin said, but his tone lacked conviction. "Aren't I? Because it seems like your job, your colleagues, even your secretary are all more interesting to you than your wife." The mention of Stephanie made Kevin flinch visibly. "Stephanie is just my assistant," he said quickly. "She helps with scheduling and client coordination. That's all?" "I'm sure she's very efficient," I replied, letting a note of skepticism creep into my voice. "She is," Kevin said, then seemed to realize that defending Stephanie's competence might not be the wisest approach. "But she's just an employee, Amanda. She's not important to me personally." The lie was so blatant that I almost called him on it directly. But something held me back. Perhaps the recognition that full confrontation would force decisions that neither of us was prepared to make. "I'm glad to hear that," I said instead, "because working together professionally is going to require clear boundaries and appropriate behavior from everyone involved." Kevin's expression grew wary. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Sterling Marketing Solutions has high standards for professional conduct, and we expect the same from our client partners. Everyone on the Pacific Architecture Group team will need to maintain appropriate workplace behavior during this project." "Of course," Kevin said, but I could see him processing the implications of my words. "Good," I replied, standing and gathering my things. "I'm sure everything will work out fine as long as everyone remembers that business relationships require respect and professionalism." I left Kevin in the living room with his whiskey and his guilty conscience, retiring to our bedroom to change clothes and process the day's events. The confrontation had gone better than I'd expected, establishing clear warnings about professional behavior without forcing a personal crisis that might derail my professional objectives. Kevin now understood that his affair with Stephanie would be conducted under my professional oversight, whether he'd planned for that complication or not. The pressure of maintaining their relationship while navigating the new business dynamic would likely create significant stress for both of them. More importantly, I had positioned myself to document any inappropriate behavior that might justify disciplinary action. If Stephanie continued to conduct herself unprofessionally, I would have legitimate grounds to address the situation through proper channels. As I prepared for bed, I reflected on how dramatically my circumstances had changed in the span of a week. Last Monday, I had been a woman whose marriage was quietly dissolving while she struggled to rebuild her career. Tonight, I was a successful marketing executive with the power to influence the professional lives of the people who had betrayed my trust. The transformation felt both surreal and deeply satisfying. For the first time in months, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny, rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond my influence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as I began the detailed work of analyzing Pacific Architecture Group's current practices and developing comprehensive improvement strategies. But tonight, I allowed myself to enjoy the simple pleasure of knowing that Stephanie Blake was probably lying awake, wondering how drastically her professional life was about to change. The irony was perfect. She had called me the old model and suggested that Kevin needed someone more contemporary for his new professional status. Now she would discover exactly how contemporary my own professional capabilities had become. Sleep came easily that night, untroubled by the guilt and uncertainty that had plagued my rest for weeks. I had work to do, plans to implement, and a future to build. Everything else was simply background noise that would resolve itself in due time. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Portland feel alive with possibility. I dressed with particular care, selecting a charcoal gray suit that projected authority without appearing intimidating, and arranged my hair in a style that suggested both professionalism and approachability. Today's meeting at Pacific Architecture Group would focus on implementation details and timeline development, but more importantly, it would be my first opportunity to begin the systematic evaluation process that would form the foundation of my comprehensive analysis. The drive downtown took me past familiar landmarks that now felt different somehow, as if the city itself had been transformed by my changed circumstances. The coffee shop where Kevin and I used to meet for breakfast during our early dating years. The park where we'd walked on lazy Sunday afternoons. The restaurant where he'd proposed 3 years ago. All of it belonged to a different version of my life, one that felt increasingly distant from my current reality. Pacific Architecture Group's lobby was busier this morning, with several clients waiting in the seating area and phone conversations creating a background hum of business activity. Marcus, the receptionist, greeted me with the same professional warmth he'd shown Monday, but I noticed he seemed more deferential now that my status as a senior representative of an important client had been established. Ms. Foster, Mr. Foster, is waiting for you in conference room B, he said, emphasizing Kevin's name in a way that suggested he was unaware of our personal connection. Can I get you coffee or water before you begin? Coffee would be lovely, thank you, I replied, following him down the familiar corridor toward the smaller conference room typically used for working meetings rather than formal presentations. Kevin was already seated at the oval table, surrounded by file folders and looking like he hadn't slept well. He stood when I entered, extending his hand in the same formal greeting we'd established during Monday's meeting. Amanda, he said, his voice carefully professional. Thank you for coming in. Of course, I replied, accepting his handshake, and noting the tension in his grip. I'm looking forward to diving into the details. We settled into chairs across from each other, maintaining the physical distance that reinforced our professional roles. Kevin had clearly prepared extensively for this meeting, with detailed notes and supporting documents arranged in neat stacks before him. I've compiled the information you requested about our current marketing practices, he began, sliding a thick folder across the table. Budget allocations, vendor relationships, campaign performance data from the last 2 years. I opened the folder and began scanning the contents, immediately noting several areas that would benefit from Sterling's strategic approach. More importantly, I could see patterns of decision-making that suggested insufficient oversight and accountability in their current processes. This is very helpful, I said, making notes in the margins of the summary document. I'd like to schedule individual interviews with key team members to understand how these strategies are being implemented at the operational level. Kevin's pen paused over his notepad. What kind of interviews? Comprehensive assessments of current practices, identification of improvement opportunities, evaluation of professional standards and client interaction protocols, I explained, using the same language I'd outlined in Monday's presentation. I'll need to speak with everyone who has significant client contact or marketing responsibilities. That would include most of the administrative staff, Kevin said carefully. Exactly. I've found that support staff often have the most direct insight into client relationships and communication effectiveness. Kevin was quiet for a moment, clearly processing the implications of what I was proposing. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. How long would these interviews take? Approximately 1 hour each, conducted individually to ensure confidentiality and encourage honest feedback, I replied. I'd like to start with your administrative team since they handle so much of the day-to-day client interaction. When were you thinking of beginning? Next week, if possible. I know that Stephanie Blake handles significant client coordination responsibilities, so I'd particularly like to interview her early in the process. Kevin's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of Stephanie's name. I'll check her schedule and coordinate with you on timing. Perfect, I said, making a note in my planner. I'll also want to observe some client interactions directly to get a sense of how your team represents the company in real-world situations. This suggestion clearly made Kevin even more uncomfortable. What kind of observations? Client meetings, phone calls, informal interactions. Nothing intrusive, just enough to understand current communication patterns and identify areas where Sterling's branding strategies could enhance effectiveness. Kevin was beginning to understand that my evaluation process would provide numerous opportunities to assess Stephanie's professional behavior, including interactions that he might prefer to keep private. That seems reasonable, he said finally, though his tone suggested he found it anything but reasonable. We spent the next hour reviewing implementation timelines and resource allocation requirements. Kevin was thorough and professional, but I could sense his underlying anxiety about the scrutiny that my work would bring to his department's operations. The meeting was interrupted halfway through by a soft knock on the conference room door. Stephanie entered with a stack of documents and an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but the Henderson project files you requested are ready for review." She moved to Kevin's side of the table, leaning over his shoulder to point out specific documents in the stack she'd delivered. The gesture was ostensibly professional, but there was an intimacy in her posture that would have been obvious to anyone paying attention. "Thank you," Kevin said, his voice slightly strained. "Could you just leave them here? We'll review everything after our meeting concludes." Stephanie glanced in my direction, her expression carefully neutral but her discomfort evident. "Of course. Is there anything else you need?" "Actually," I interjected smoothly, "since you're here, this might be a good time to schedule your interview for the brand assessment project." Stephanie's smile faltered slightly. "Interview?" "We discussed it in Monday's meeting," I explained. "Sterling will be conducting comprehensive interviews with key team members to evaluate current marketing and client communication practices." "Oh, right," Stephanie said, though her tone suggested she'd hoped that particular requirement might have been forgotten. "Would next Tuesday afternoon work for you?" I continued, consulting my planner. "Say, 2:00?" Stephanie looked to Kevin as if seeking guidance, but he was studying his notes with obvious reluctance to intervene. "Tuesday afternoon should be fine," she said finally. "Excellent," I replied, making the appointment notation. "The interview will take approximately 1 hour and will cover everything from client interaction protocols to brand representation standards." The emphasis on brand representation standards was deliberate, and I could see both Kevin and Stephanie processing the implications. The interview would provide me with a perfect opportunity to address professional behavior expectations and document any patterns of inappropriate conduct. "I'll prepare whatever materials you need," Stephanie said, her voice slightly higher than usual. "That won't be necessary," I assured her. "This will be more of a conversational assessment focused on current practices and improvement opportunities." After Stephanie left the room, Kevin and I continued our planning discussion, but the atmosphere had grown noticeably more tense. Kevin was clearly struggling to balance his role as my primary client contact with his desire to protect Stephanie from professional scrutiny. "Is there anything specific I should tell the team about these interviews?" he asked as our meeting neared its conclusion. "Just that Sterling is committed to developing strategies that build on existing strengths while addressing areas for improvement," I replied. "The interviews are designed to gather information, not to create problems for anyone." Kevin looked slightly relieved by this assurance, though I suspected he would be less comfortable if he understood exactly what kind of information I planned to gather. "The important thing is that everyone understands the importance of maintaining professional standards throughout this process," I continued. "Our collaboration needs to reflect well on both organizations." "Of course," Kevin agreed quickly. "Good. I'll send you a detailed interview schedule by tomorrow, and we can begin the assessment process next week." As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave, Kevin hesitated as if wanting to say something more personal. Finally, he seemed to decide against it, maintaining our professional boundaries despite obvious discomfort with the situation. "Thank you for your time today," he said formally. "Thank you for the thorough preparation," I replied. "I'm looking forward to working with your team." The drive back to Sterling's offices gave me time to process the morning's developments. Kevin was clearly under significant stress, caught between his professional obligations and his personal complications. Stephanie appeared to be growing increasingly anxious about the scrutiny her behavior would receive during the evaluation process. Most importantly, I had established clear protocols for systematic assessment of their workplace conduct, all under the legitimate auspices of improving client service and brand representation. Back at my office, I began developing detailed interview questions that would allow me to thoroughly evaluate Stephanie's professionalism while maintaining strict adherence to appropriate business practices. The questions would cover client communication, standards, workplace behavior expectations, and brand representation requirements. If Stephanie had learned to conduct herself appropriately since the company party, the interview would simply confirm that she understood professional standards. If she continued to display the arrogance and unprofessionalism she'd shown toward me, I would have documented evidence to support recommendations about her suitability for client-facing responsibilities. Either way, Tuesday's interview would be illuminating. Nicole called that afternoon as I was finishing my interview preparation. "How did it go?" she asked without preamble. "Very well," I replied. Both Kevin and Stephanie now understand that their professional behavior will be subject to ongoing evaluation. And how are they handling that revelation? About as well as you'd expect. Kevin looks like he hasn't slept in days, and Stephanie seems to be realizing that insulting the wife of your boss's contact person might not have been her smartest career move. Nicole's laugh was sharp with satisfaction. "Good. They both deserve to sweat a little after what they put you through." "I'm not trying to make them suffer," I protested, though with less conviction than I might have shown a week earlier. Of course not. You're just doing your job with exceptional thoroughness and attention to professional standards. The fact that this creates discomfort for people who've behaved badly is simply an unfortunate coincidence." "Exactly," I agreed, unable to suppress a smile. "So what's next?" Tuesday afternoon, I interview Stephanie. 1 hour, just the two of us, discussing professional standards and workplace behavior. "Oh, that's going to be interesting," Nicole said with obvious relish. "I hope you're planning to document everything thoroughly." Naturally, Sterling maintains detailed records of all client assessments. Naturally, and if Miss Old Model happens to reveal some concerning attitudes about professional conduct during this documented assessment, then I'll have to address those concerns through appropriate channels, I replied primly. "Amanda Foster, you are becoming absolutely ruthless, and I love it." After ending the call, I returned to my interview preparation with renewed focus. Tuesday's conversation with Stephanie would be crucial, not just for the Pacific Architecture Group project, but for establishing how my personal and professional lives would intersect going forward. The woman who had dismissed me as outdated and irrelevant was about to discover exactly how contemporary my approach to professional accountability could be. And I was very much looking forward to the conversation. Tuesday arrived with an unseasonable warmth that had people in downtown Portland shedding jackets and opening windows. I chose my outfit with strategic precision, a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white blouse that projected exactly the right balance of authority and approachability. Today's interview with Stephanie Blake would set the tone for all future interactions, and I wanted to ensure that my professional presence was unassailable. The morning passed quickly as I finalized my interview questions and reviewed Sterling's protocols for client assessment documentation. Everything needed to be above board, thoroughly professional and legally bulletproof. I wasn't looking to create problems where none existed, but I was absolutely prepared to address any issues that revealed themselves during our conversation. At 1:30, I gathered my materials and made the short drive to Pacific Architecture Group's offices. The familiar route felt different now that I was approaching it as a professional with legitimate business objectives, rather than simply as Kevin's wife attending a social function. Marcus greeted me with his usual courtesy, directing me to a small conference room on the 3rd floor that had been designated for my use during the interview process. The room was intimate without being cramped, with comfortable seating and natural light that would encourage open conversation. I arranged my materials on the table, positioning my laptop for note-taking and ensuring that my digital recorder was properly configured. Sterling maintained strict documentation standards for all client assessments, and today's conversation would be no exception. At exactly 2 o'clock, there was a soft knock on the door. Stephanie entered with a confident smile that didn't quite mask the anxiety in her eyes. She had dressed professionally in a black pencil skirt and emerald green blouse, her platinum, hairstyled in a sleek bob that framed her face elegantly. "Amanda," she said, extending her hand with apparent warmth. "Thank you for accommodating my schedule." "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from me. "I appreciate you taking the time for this assessment." Stephanie settled into her seat, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap with movements that seemed rehearsed. She was clearly prepared to present her most professional demeanor, which suggested she understood the potential significance of our conversation. "Before we begin," I said, starting the digital recorder, "I want to explain the purpose of today's interview. Sterling Marketing Solutions is conducting comprehensive assessments of Pacific Architecture Group's current practices to identify strengths we can build upon and areas where we might recommend improvements." "That makes perfect sense," Stephanie replied, her voice steady and professional. "The conversation will focus on your role in client relationships, communication protocols, and brand representation. Everything we discuss will be documented as part of our overall evaluation, so please feel free to be honest about current practices and any challenges you've observed." Stephanie nodded, though I noticed her smile had become slightly more forced. "Let's start with your current responsibilities," I continued, consulting my prepared questions. "Can you describe your primary duties as administrative assistant in the project management division?" "Certainly," Stephanie said, launching into what sounded like a well-rehearsed summary of her job functions. She covered scheduling, client coordination, document preparation, and communication management with confident efficiency. As she spoke, I made notes on my laptop, occasionally asking follow-up questions about specific processes or protocols. Her responses were technically accurate and professionally appropriate, but there was something calculated about her performance that suggested she was being extremely careful about every word. "You mentioned client coordination," I said, after she'd finished her overview. "Can you give me some specific examples of how you interact with clients on behalf of Pacific Architecture Group?" Stephanie's composure flickered slightly. "Well, I handle scheduling for client meetings, prepare materials for presentations, and sometimes participate in conference calls to take notes or provide project updates." "And how would you describe your approach to client communication?" "Professional, courteous, always focused on representing the company's best interests," she replied quickly. "That's excellent," I said, making a note. "Professional representation is crucial in a service industry. Can you think of any situations where maintaining that professional standard might be challenging?" The question was deliberately open-ended, designed to see how she would respond to the opportunity for self-reflection. Stephanie considered for a moment before answering. "Sometimes clients can be demanding or unreasonable," she said carefully. "But I've found that maintaining a calm, professional demeanor usually diffuses any tension." "Very good. And what about internal relationships? How do you handle situations where personal feelings might conflict with professional obligations?" This question was more pointed, and I could see Stephanie processing its implications. She shifted slightly in her chair, her polished exterior showing the first signs of strain. "I believe in keeping personal and professional matters completely separate," she said, though her tone had lost some of its earlier confidence. "That's an admirable principle," I replied. "Can you give me an example of how you've applied that principle in your work here?" Stephanie hesitated, clearly struggling to find an appropriate example that wouldn't reveal anything about her relationship with Kevin. "Well, there are times when colleagues might have personal disagreements or conflicts, but I always focus on what's best for the project and the client," she said finally. "Of course. And what about situations involving clients' family members or personal connections? How do you handle those dynamics?" The question hit its target precisely. Stephanie's carefully maintained composure cracked just enough to reveal the anxiety beneath. I'm not sure I understand, she said, though her expression suggested she understood perfectly. Sometimes in business, you encounter situations where professional relationships intersect with personal ones, I explained. For example, you might find yourself working with someone whose spouse or family member is connected to a client or vendor. How do you navigate those situations while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries? Stephanie was quiet for a long moment, clearly recognizing that this line of questioning was leading somewhere specific. When she finally spoke, her voice was more cautious than before. I think it's important to treat everyone with respect and professionalism, regardless of their personal connections, she said. Absolutely, I agreed. Respect is fundamental to all professional interactions. Have you ever encountered a situation where someone in your workplace failed to show appropriate respect to a colleague or client connection? The trap was subtle but effective. If Stephanie claimed to have never witnessed inappropriate behavior, she would be lying in a documented interview. If she acknowledged such situations, I could probe deeper into her understanding of professional standards. There have been occasional instances where people might not have been as respectful as they should have been, she admitted reluctantly. Can you describe one of those instances? Stephanie's discomfort was becoming more visible. She uncrossed and recrossed her legs, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her skirt. It's difficult to think of specific examples, she said. Just general situations where someone might have been dismissive or condescending to others. I see. And in those situations, what do you think would be the appropriate response? To intervene if possible, or to report the behavior to management if it was serious enough, Stephanie replied, though she seemed to realize that her answer might have implications for her own conduct. That's exactly right, I said, making another note. Creating a respectful workplace environment is everyone's responsibility. Now let's talk about external brand representation. How do you think Pacific Architecture Group employees should conduct themselves at company events or social functions? This question brought us directly to the territory I'd been carefully approaching. Stephanie's face went pale as she realized where the conversation was heading. Company events are important for networking and relationship building, she said slowly. Everyone should represent the organization professionally. And what does professional representation look like in those settings? Appropriate dress? Courteous behavior? Positive attitude? She listed mechanically. Good. What about interactions with clients' spouses or family members at those events? Stephanie was clearly struggling now, caught between her desire to appear professional and her growing realization that this interview was far more specific than she'd anticipated. The same standards would apply, she said quietly. Professional courtesy and respect. Of course. Have you ever attended a company function where you observed behavior that didn't meet those standards? The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds as Stephanie wrestled with her response. Finally, she seemed to decide that some form of honesty was her safest option. The company party last week, she said barely above a whisper. What about it? There may have been some interactions that weren't as professional as they could have been. Can you be more specific? Stephanie looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. Some comments were made that were inappropriate. What kind of comments? Personal remarks about people's appearance or lifestyle choices, she said, her voice growing smaller with each word. I see. And who made these inappropriate comments? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Stephanie could continue, deflecting, but we both knew exactly what had happened at the company party and who had been responsible for the inappropriate behavior. I did, she whispered finally. Can you tell me more about what you said? Stephanie closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering courage for what she knew she had to confess. I made some disparaging remarks about someone's appearance and suggested that they were outdated or no longer relevant, she said, the words coming out in a rush. It was completely inappropriate and unprofessional. And who was the target of these remarks? You, Stephanie said, barely audible. I said inappropriate things about you. The admission hung between us, finally bringing the real purpose of our conversation into the open. Stephanie looked mortified, clearly understanding that she had just confessed to serious professional misconduct in a documented interview. Thank you for your honesty, I said calmly. Can you help me understand what motivated those comments? Stephanie was quiet for a long time, struggling with how much truth she could afford to reveal. I was feeling insecure, she said finally. And I took that out on you inappropriately. Insecure about what? Another long pause. About my position at the company, about my relationships with colleagues. It was a careful answer, acknowledging emotional motivation without explicitly admitting to her affair with Kevin. But the implication was clear enough. I appreciate your honesty about what happened, I said. Now I'd like to discuss what you think the appropriate response should be to this kind of behavior. Stephanie looked up sharply, clearly hoping that her confession might be the end of the matter rather than the beginning of consequences. I understand that my behavior was unacceptable, she said quickly. It won't happen again. I'm glad to hear that, I replied. But inappropriate conduct toward clients or their family members is a serious matter that typically requires more than just a personal commitment to improvement. What do you mean? I mean that Pacific Architecture Group's reputation depends on all employees maintaining professional standards, especially in public settings. When those standards are violated, there usually need to be formal consequences to ensure that the behavior doesn't continue. Stephanie's face went white. Are you going to report this to management? I'm going to include a full assessment of professional conduct issues in my report to Pacific Architecture Group's executive team, I said matter-of-factly. That's part of Sterling's comprehensive evaluation process. But it was just one incident, Stephanie protested. I apologized, and I promised it wouldn't happen again. Actually, you didn't apologize, I corrected gently. You acknowledged that the behavior occurred, but you never expressed genuine remorse or took full responsibility for your actions. Stephanie stared at me, clearly realizing that her careful non-apology had been insufficient. I am sorry, she said desperately. I'm truly sorry for what I said. It was wrong, and I deeply regret it. I appreciate that, I said. But you understand that the damage to Pacific Architecture Group's professional reputation has already occurred. Other employees and clients witnessed your behavior, and that reflects on the entire organization. What can I do to fix this? Stephanie asked, tears beginning to form in her eyes. That's not really my decision to make, I replied. I'll be providing my assessment to the executive team, and they'll determine what actions are appropriate. Please, Stephanie said, her professional composure finally cracking completely. I can't lose this job. I'll do anything to make this right. The best thing you can do is continue to be honest about what happened and demonstrate a genuine commitment to professional growth, I said. Beyond that, the decision about your future with the company rests with Pacific Architecture Group's management. The rest of the interview proceeded more quickly, with Stephanie answering my remaining questions in a subdued, defeated tone. Her earlier confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by obvious anxiety about her professional future. When we concluded 45 minutes later, Stephanie gathered her things with movements that seemed mechanical, her earlier poise completely gone. Thank you for your time, I said as she prepared to leave. I'll be compiling my assessment over the next few days. When will you be presenting your findings? She asked quietly. The executive review is scheduled for next Tuesday, I replied. All department heads will be present, including Kevin. Stephanie nodded numbly and left the conference room without another word. I remained seated for several minutes after her departure, processing what had just occurred. The interview had gone better than I'd hoped, with Stephanie not only acknowledging her inappropriate behavior, but providing a detailed confession that would be impossible to dispute or minimize. More importantly, I had conducted the entire conversation within proper professional protocols. Nothing I had done was unethical or vindictive. I had simply created an opportunity for honest assessment of workplace conduct, and Stephanie had chosen to reveal the truth about her behavior. The executive review next Tuesday would be interesting. Crawford and his team would have to address the fact that one of their employees had behaved inappropriately toward a key client's representative in a public setting while representing their company. My phone buzzed with a text message from Kevin as I was packing up my materials. "How did the interview go?" I typed back a brief, professional response. "Very informative. I'll have my assessment ready for next week's executive review." His reply came quickly. "Is there anything I should know about?" "We'll discuss everything at the appropriate time with the full team," I responded. I could imagine Kevin's anxiety spiking as he tried to interpret my carefully neutral responses. He probably suspected that Stephanie had revealed something significant, but he wouldn't know the details until the executive review. The drive back to Sterling's offices gave me time to organize my thoughts and begin structuring my assessment report. The document would need to be thorough, objective, and focused on business impact rather than personal grievances. Stephanie's conduct at the company party had violated multiple professional standards. She had made disparaging remarks about a client representative in a public setting, demonstrated poor judgment in her interpersonal communications, and shown a concerning lack of respect for appropriate workplace boundaries. These weren't personal failings that could be overlooked in the interest of maintaining harmony. They were professional deficiencies that directly impacted Pacific Architecture Group's ability to maintain productive client relationships. Back at my office, I began drafting the assessment report, focusing on documented facts and objective analysis of professional standards. The language was clinical and precise, devoid of emotional content but devastating in its implications. The section on administrative staff performance included detailed findings about communication protocols, client interaction standards, and brand representation effectiveness. Stephanie's confession was documented verbatim, along with my assessment of the behavior's impact on company reputation and client relationships. I also included recommendations for addressing the identified deficiencies, ranging from additional training programs to personnel adjustments that might be necessary to ensure appropriate professional standards. By late afternoon, I had completed a comprehensive 20-page report that would serve as the foundation for next Tuesday's executive review. The document was thorough, professional, and utterly damning in its assessment of Stephanie's conduct. Nicole called just as I was finishing the final revisions. "So," she said without preamble, "how did it go with Miss Old Model?" "Very well," I replied. She was quite forthcoming about her professional conduct standards. Define forthcoming. She provided a detailed confession about her inappropriate behavior at the company party, acknowledged that her conduct was unprofessional, and admitted that she had made disparaging remarks about me in a public setting. She confessed? To everything? To enough, I said with satisfaction. She basically handed me a documented admission of professional misconduct that will be very difficult for Pacific Architecture Group's management to ignore. "Oh, this is beautiful," Nicole said with obvious delight. She walked right into it. She did indeed. And now Crawford and his team have to decide how to address the fact that their administrative staff has been insulting client representatives at company functions. What do you think they'll do? That depends on how seriously they take their professional reputation, I said. But I suspect Stephanie's going to discover that actions have consequences. And Kevin? Kevin will be sitting in that executive review meeting listening to his boss discuss disciplinary action against his girlfriend. It should be quite educational for him. Amanda, you are absolutely brilliant. This is perfect justice. After ending the call, I returned to my report for final review. Everything was documented, objective, and professionally appropriate. Stephanie had provided the rope for her own professional hanging, and I had simply ensured that it was properly documented. The executive review next Tuesday would determine how Pacific Architecture Group chose to address the situation. But regardless of their specific actions, Stephanie Blake would learn that calling someone the old model and dismissing their career as irrelevant carried professional consequences that she hadn't anticipated. The irony was perfect. She had assumed that her position as Kevin's secretary made her untouchable, that her youth and attractiveness gave her advantages that older, more experienced women couldn't match. Instead, she was about to discover that professional competence and strategic thinking were far more valuable than either youth or beauty in the corporate world. Thursday evening at home passed with unusual tension. Kevin was clearly on edge, asking careful questions about my work while trying to gauge my mood and intentions. I maintained pleasant but distant conversation, discussing general business topics while avoiding any specifics about Tuesday's interview or the upcoming executive review. "How are the interviews going?" he asked over dinner, his tone studiedly casual. "Very informative," I replied. "I'm learning a great deal about Pacific Architecture Group's current practices and culture." "Anything concerning?" "There are always areas for improvement in any organization," I said neutrally. "That's why companies hire consultants." Kevin's jaw tightened slightly. "I hope Stephanie's interview went well. She was nervous about it." "She was very cooperative," I replied. "We had a productive conversation about professional standards and workplace conduct." "Good," Kevin said, though his expression suggested he found my carefully neutral responses anything but reassuring. "When will you be presenting your findings?" he continued. "Tuesday morning. Crawford scheduled an executive review to discuss my preliminary assessment." "Will I be included in that meeting?" "As my primary point of contact, yes, you'll be there for the full presentation." Kevin nodded, but I could see him processing the implications of what that might mean. If the review included discussion of personnel issues or professional conduct problems, he would be sitting in the room when his affair with Stephanie became a matter of executive attention. The weekend passed quietly, with Kevin making obvious efforts to be more attentive and engaging than he'd been in months. He suggested dinner at our favorite restaurant, proposed a drive to the coast for Sunday brunch, and generally behaved like a man trying to shore up his relationship in anticipation of coming difficulties. I accepted his overtures with polite appreciation, playing the role of the gracious wife while mentally preparing for Tuesday's presentation. The executive review would be the culmination of everything I'd been working toward since that humiliating evening at the company party. Monday morning, I made final revisions to my assessment report and prepared the presentation materials for the executive team. Everything was ready for what would likely be the most professionally satisfying meeting of my career. The irony wasn't lost on me that exactly 2 weeks ago, I had been the dismissed wife standing awkwardly at a company party while her husband's secretary insulted her to her face. Tomorrow, I would be the senior marketing executive presenting findings that could end that same secretary's career. Sometimes justice moved slowly, but when it finally arrived, it was absolutely worth the wait. Tuesday morning arrived clear and cold, the kind of crisp autumn day that made everything seem sharply defined and full of possibility. I dressed with particular care, selecting a charcoal suit that projected uncompromising professionalism, and arranged my presentation materials with meticulous attention to detail. Today's executive review would be the culmination of 2 weeks of careful planning and systematic documentation. Every question I'd asked, every protocol I'd followed, every standard I'd applied had been building toward this moment. The drive to Pacific Architecture Group felt different this morning, weighted with anticipation and the satisfaction of a plan coming to fruition. In 48 hours, I had transformed from a humiliated wife into a professional with the power to demand accountability from the people who had treated me with such contempt. The lobby was busy with morning activity, but Marcus directed me immediately to the executive conference room where Crawford and his senior team were already assembled. The same room where I'd first presented my marketing strategy, where Kevin and Stephanie had first realized that their professional lives would be subject to my oversight. Crawford stood to greet me as I entered, his expression serious but expectant. "Amanda, thank you for your comprehensive work on this assessment. We're looking forward to your findings." The executive team was fully represented. Crawford as president, Patricia Wells from business development, David Chen from operations, and 3 other department heads whose areas intersected with marketing and client relations. Kevin sat at the far end of the table, his face carefully neutral but his posture tense with obvious anxiety. "Thank you for the opportunity to evaluate Pacific Architecture Group's current practices," I replied, settling into the chair that had been designated for my use. "I believe you'll find the assessment both informative and actionable." I connected my laptop to the projection system and began with an overview of Sterling's evaluation methodology, explaining the comprehensive approach that had guided my analysis. The early slides covered general findings about brand positioning, market presence, and competitive advantages. Crawford and his team listened attentively, asking occasional questions about specific recommendations or implementation strategies. These were the routine aspects of any marketing assessment, important for business development, but unremarkable in terms of immediate drama. Now I'd like to address some specific operational issues that impact brand representation and client relationships, I said, advancing to a slide titled Professional Standards Assessment. Kevin's posture became even more rigid, and I could see him bracing for whatever revelations were about to emerge. During my evaluation process, I conducted detailed interviews with key personnel to understand current practices and identify areas for improvement, I continued. These conversations revealed some concerning patterns that require executive attention. Crawford leaned forward, his expression becoming more focused. "What kind of patterns?" "Issues related to professional conduct, particularly in client-facing situations and public representation of the company," I replied, advancing to the next slide. The room was completely silent now, with every executive giving me their full attention. Kevin looked like he might be physically ill. Specifically, I documented instances of inappropriate behavior toward client representatives, including disparaging comments made in public settings that reflect poorly on Pacific Architecture Group's professional standards. "Can you be more specific?" Wells asked, her voice sharp with concern. I advanced to a slide that contained direct quotes from Stephanie's interview, presented without attribution, but devastating in their implications. During the assessment process, one administrative staff member acknowledged making inappropriate remarks about a client representative, including comments about their appearance and professional relevance. These remarks were made at a company function in the presence of other employees and clients. Crawford's face darkened as he read the quoted material. "This is completely unacceptable. Who was responsible for these comments?" "Stephanie Blake, administrative assistant in the project management division," I replied calmly. Kevin closed his eyes briefly, as if hoping that when he opened them, this conversation might prove to have been a nightmare. "What exactly did she say?" Chen asked. I consulted my notes, reading from the interview transcript in a professional, matter-of-fact tone. Ms. Blake acknowledged making disparaging remarks about the client representative's appearance, suggesting that they were outdated and no longer relevant to modern professional environments. She also made inappropriate comparisons between the client representative and what she characterized as more contemporary alternatives. The silence in the room was absolute. Every executive was processing the implications of what I'd just revealed, while Kevin appeared to be contemplating the professional disaster unfolding around him. "This behavior occurred at our company party 2 weeks ago," Crawford asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Yes, in full view of other employees and clients," I confirmed. "And Ms. Blake admitted to this behavior in her interview with you?" "Yes, she provided a complete acknowledgement of her inappropriate conduct." Crawford turned to Kevin with an expression that suggested severe displeasure. Kevin, as Ms. Blake's supervisor, were you aware of this incident? Kevin's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to respond. There was some tension at the party, but I wasn't fully aware of the specific comments. It was a careful answer, technically truthful while avoiding acknowledgement of his own role in the situation. But Crawford's expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the explanation. Tension? Wells interjected. Kevin, one of your staff members insulted a client representative at a company function. How is that merely tension? I should have addressed it more directly, Kevin admitted, his voice barely audible. Yes, you should have, Crawford agreed. Coldly. Amanda, what impact do you believe this incident has had on Sterling's relationship with our organization? It was a perfect opening for me to address the broader implications of Stephanie's behavior. Sterling Marketing Solutions has high standards for professional conduct, and we expect the same from our client partners, I replied. Behavior that demonstrates disrespect for client representatives raises questions about an organization's commitment to professional excellence. Of course it does, Crawford said. And what recommendations do you have for addressing this situation? I advanced to my final slide, which outlined specific steps for ensuring professional standards compliance. First, immediate disciplinary action appropriate to the severity of the misconduct. Second, mandatory professional conduct training for all client-facing staff. Third, clear protocols for reporting and addressing inappropriate behavior in the future. Crawford nodded grimly. Those recommendations seem entirely appropriate. Kevin, I want you to schedule a disciplinary meeting with Ms. Blake for this afternoon. HR will be present and will be discussing termination for professional misconduct. Kevin's face went completely white. Termination? Absolutely, Crawford replied. Insulting client representatives at company functions is grounds for immediate dismissal. It's a clear violation of our professional conduct policies. But, Kevin began, then stopped as he realized he had no professional grounds for defending Stephanie's behavior. Is there something you'd like to add? Crawford asked pointedly. No, sir, Kevin said quietly. Good. Patricia, please coordinate with HR to ensure this matter is handled appropriately. I want Ms. Blake's employment terminated today, and I want documentation of the incident placed in her personnel file. Wells nodded efficiently. I'll handle it immediately. Crawford turned back to me with an expression of professional embarrassment. Amanda, I want to apologize on behalf of Pacific Architecture Group for Ms. Blake's inappropriate behavior. This kind of conduct is absolutely contrary to our organizational values. I appreciate that, I replied. These situations are unfortunate, but they also provide opportunities for organizations to demonstrate their commitment to professional excellence. Exactly right, Crawford agreed. And I want to assure you that Sterling will not experience any similar issues during our partnership. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, covering implementation details for the marketing strategies I'd proposed. But the energy in the room had shifted dramatically. Stephanie's misconduct had become the dominant topic, with multiple executives expressing concern about how such behavior could have occurred and what steps needed to be taken to prevent similar incidents. Kevin contributed little to the remaining discussion, clearly struggling to process the fact that his girlfriend was about to be fired as a direct result of her behavior toward his wife. When the meeting concluded, Crawford asked me to stay behind for a brief private conversation. Amanda, I want you to know how much I appreciate your professionalism in handling this situation, he said once the room had cleared. Lesser consultants might have simply ended the business relationship rather than providing us with an opportunity to address the problem. Sterling believes in working collaboratively with clients to resolve issues, I replied. Professional? Misconduct reflects poorly on everyone involved, but it can be addressed when there's commitment to improvement. There absolutely is, Crawford assured me. And I want to personally guarantee that you'll receive nothing but respectful, professional treatment from every member of our team going forward. As I left Pacific Architecture Group's offices that afternoon, I reflected on how completely the situation had been transformed. Stephanie Blake would be cleaning out her desk before the end of the day. Her career at the company ended by the same arrogance that had led her to insult me at the company party. Kevin would return home that evening to face not only the end of his affair, but also the professional embarrassment of having his girlfriend fired for misconduct toward his wife. And I would return to Sterling Marketing Solutions as the senior executive who had successfully identified and addressed a serious professional conduct issue, strengthening both my reputation and my company's relationship with an important client. The woman who had called me the old model had just learned that experience, professionalism, and strategic thinking were far more powerful than youth and misplaced confidence. Sometimes justice was swift and decisive, and sometimes it was absolutely perfect. The afternoon sun was filtering through my office windows when my phone buzzed with an urgent text from Kevin. Need to talk. Coming home early. The message arrived at 3:45, which meant he would likely be pulling into our driveway within the hour. Freshly emerged from what had undoubtedly been the most professionally humiliating day of his career. I gathered my materials methodically, saving the final version of my Pacific Architecture Group assessment report and organizing the client files that would guide our continued collaboration. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Kevin was dealing with the fallout from his girlfriend's termination, I was planning the next phase of a project that would likely earn Sterling Marketing Solutions recognition for excellence in client relationship management. The drive home took me through the familiar streets of our Riverside District neighborhood, past the coffee shops and boutiques that had formed the backdrop of our married life. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, but I felt fundamentally different, as if the day's events had shifted something essential in my understanding of my own capabilities and worth. Our house sat peacefully under the maple trees that were just beginning to show their autumn colors, the wraparound porch, and craftsman details creating an image of domestic tranquility that no longer matched the reality of what was happening inside our marriage. Kevin's car was already in the driveway when I arrived, and I could see him through the kitchen window, pacing back and forth with his phone pressed to his ear. His posture was tense, his movements agitated, and even from a distance I could tell he was having a difficult conversation. I entered through the front door, setting my briefcase in its usual spot and hanging my jacket in the hall closet. The house was quiet, except for Kevin's voice drifting from the kitchen, though he was speaking too quietly for me to make out specific words. By the time I reached the kitchen, Kevin had ended his call and was standing with his back to me, staring out the window at our small backyard garden. His shoulders were rigid with stress, and his usual confidence had been replaced by obvious distress. "Long day?" I asked, my tone neutral and conversational. Kevin turned around slowly, his face drawn and exhausted. "You could say that." "The executive review went well, I thought," I continued, opening the refrigerator to retrieve a bottle of water. "Crawford and his team seem committed to maintaining high professional standards." Kevin's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Professional standards, right. Is there a problem with that concept?" I asked, meeting his eyes directly. "You know exactly what the problem is, Amanda," Kevin said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Stephanie was fired today, terminated for professional misconduct." "I heard," I replied calmly. "Crawford mentioned that appropriate disciplinary action would be taken." "Appropriate?" Kevin's voice rose slightly. "She lost her job, Amanda. Her career is ruined." "Her career was damaged by her own choices," I corrected. "Specifically, her choice to behave inappropriately toward a client representative at a company function." Kevin stared at me for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to respond to my matter-of-fact assessment of the situation. "You planned this," he said finally. "The whole thing was a setup from the beginning." I plan to do my job professionally and thoroughly, I replied. If that created problems for people who had behaved unprofessionally, that's unfortunate, but not unexpected. Bullshit, Kevin said, his composure finally cracking. You went after Stephanie deliberately because of what happened at the party. What happened at the party was that your secretary insulted me to my face while you stood by and said nothing, I said, my own voice sharpening. What happened today was that she admitted to professional misconduct in a documented interview. She apologized for that. No, Kevin, she didn't. She acknowledged that inappropriate comments were made, but she never expressed genuine remorse or took full responsibility for her behavior. And even if she had apologized, that doesn't erase the professional implications of insulting client representatives. Kevin began pacing again, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized as his response to overwhelming stress. She's devastated, he said. She called me crying, saying her reputation is destroyed and she'll never find another position in the industry. Then perhaps she should have considered those consequences before she decided to call me the old model and suggest that you needed someone more contemporary, I replied. The directness of my response seemed to shock Kevin into momentary silence. We had been dancing around the specifics of Stephanie's insults for 2 weeks, but now the words hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. She was drunk, Kevin said weakly. People say stupid things when they've been drinking. She wasn't drunk when she conducted herself unprofessionally in other contexts, I pointed out. And alcohol doesn't excuse disrespectful behavior toward clients or their representatives. Other contexts? What are you talking about? I studied Kevin's face carefully, noting the genuine confusion in his expression. Either he was an excellent actor, or he genuinely didn't understand the full scope of what I was implying. Kevin, I said slowly, do you really believe that Stephanie's inappropriate behavior was limited to one evening of poor judgment? What do you mean? I mean that someone who would insult a client's wife at a company party probably has other professional judgment issues that management should be aware of. Kevin's face went pale as he began to understand the implications of what I was suggesting. You investigated her, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I evaluated the professional conduct standards of all administrative staff with client-facing responsibilities, I corrected. That's part of comprehensive brand assessment. And what did you find? I found patterns of behavior that suggest poor professional judgment and insufficient understanding of appropriate workplace conduct, I replied. Kevin sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his face in his hands. Oh, God. Amanda, what have you done? I've done my job, I said firmly. I've identified professional conduct issues that impact client relationships and recommended appropriate corrective action. Your job? Kevin looked up at me with an expression of growing horror. Your job was to destroy someone's career over a personal grudge? My job was to assess Pacific Architecture Group's brand representation capabilities and identify areas for improvement, I said, my voice growing colder. The fact that this assessment revealed misconduct by someone who happens to be sleeping with my husband is simply an unfortunate coincidence. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, finally bringing the subtext of our entire conversation into the open. Kevin's face went through several expressions before settling on something that might have been relief mixed with dread. So, you know, he said quietly. I've known for weeks, I replied. What I didn't know was whether you had the courage to end our marriage honestly, or whether you'd prefer to continue lying while you figured out your next move. Kevin was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded on the kitchen table. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued and tired. I never meant for it to happen, he said. It just developed over time, working late, spending so much time together on projects. Spare me the romantic narrative, I interrupted. Affairs don't just happen, Kevin. They're choices. You chose to pursue a relationship with your secretary, while remaining married to me. I know, he said. I know it was wrong. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you thought you could manage both relationships indefinitely, while I remained obliviously grateful for whatever attention you chose to give me. Kevin flinched at the accuracy of my assessment. That's not how I saw it. How did you see it? Kevin was quiet for another long moment, clearly struggling to articulate thoughts he'd probably never fully examined. I thought maybe we could work things out, he said finally. That maybe, if I had some time to figure out what I really wanted, we could find a way to save our marriage. By continuing to sleep with your secretary while lying to your wife. I know how it sounds, Kevin said defensively. But I was confused, Amanda. I didn't know how to handle the situation. You could have talked to me, I pointed out. You could have suggested counseling or separation, or any number of honest approaches to dealing with marital problems. I should have, he agreed. I was a coward. Yes, you were, and your cowardice created a situation where your girlfriend felt comfortable insulting me in public because she assumed I was too weak or ignorant to do anything about it. Kevin looked up sharply. She told me she apologized to you. She told you a lot of things that weren't true, I replied, including, presumably, that her behavior toward me was acceptable or justified. She said you were cold to her at the party, that you seemed hostile. I laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. I was cold to her? Kevin, she told me to my face that I was outdated and that you needed someone more contemporary. She called me the old model and suggested that I should step aside for a newer version. And you think I was the one who was hostile? Kevin's face went through several expressions as he processed this information. She said you misunderstood her comments. Did I misunderstand when she said that loyalty was important, but that holding on to something just because it's familiar wasn't always the best choice? Did I misunderstand when she compared me to an old car that should be traded in for a newer model? She said those things? She said those things and more, while you stood across the room and watched. And then she had the audacity to tell me that my career was just a little job to keep me busy. Kevin looked genuinely shocked by the specific details of Stephanie's behavior. Amanda, I had no idea she said anything that specific. Of course you didn't, because you were too much of a coward to pay attention to how your girlfriend was treating your wife. I would have stopped her if I'd known. Would you? Because it seems to me that you were perfectly content to let her believe that she could treat me however she wanted without consequences. Kevin was quiet again, clearly struggling with the implications of what I was telling him. What happens now? He asked finally. Now you deal with the consequences of your choices, I replied. Stephanie's termination is just the beginning. What do you mean? I mean that Crawford and his executive team now have serious questions about your judgment and leadership capabilities, I explained. Your direct report engaged in misconduct toward a key client representative, and you failed to address it appropriately. Kevin's face went pale. Are you saying my job is in jeopardy? I'm saying that your professional reputation has been damaged by your association with someone who demonstrated such poor judgment, I replied. Whether that impacts your long-term career prospects depends on how well you handle the situation going forward. And our marriage? Our marriage ended the moment you decided to have an affair, I said calmly. What we're discussing now is simply the administrative details of dissolving a partnership that you've already abandoned. Kevin stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in months. You're different, he said finally. I'm exactly the same person I've always been, I corrected. The difference is that I'm no longer willing to accept being treated with disrespect or taken for granted. I never took you for granted. Kevin, you moved your girlfriend into a position where she felt comfortable insulting me at your company party Because she was confident that you wouldn't object. If that's not taking me for granted, I don't know what is. Kevin had no response to that observation, and we sat in silence for several minutes while he processed the full scope of how completely his life had been altered in the span of a few hours. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "I want you to move out," I said without hesitation. "Tonight, if possible." "Tonight?" "Our marriage is over, Kevin. There's no point in prolonging the inevitable or pretending that we can somehow work through this. But we could try counseling, or separation, or something less permanent." "To what end? So you can continue your relationship with Stephanie while keeping me as a backup option?" "Stephanie and I are over," Kevin said quickly. "Her termination makes any relationship impossible." "How convenient that you've suddenly discovered your commitment to our marriage now that your other option has been eliminated." Kevin winced at the sarcasm in my voice. "That's not fair." "Fair. Kevin, you've been lying to me for months while conducting an affair with a woman who treated me like an obstacle to be removed. You enabled her disrespectful behavior and failed to defend your wife when she was being insulted in public. Exactly what part of this situation do you think has been fair to me?" "I know I've made mistakes," Kevin said desperately. "But marriage is supposed to be about forgiveness and working through problems. Marriage is supposed to be about honesty, respect, and mutual support," I replied. "You violated all of those principles when you decided that your secretary was more important than your wife." "She wasn't more important. Your actions suggest otherwise." Kevin was quiet again, and I could see him searching for some argument that might change my mind or create an opening for reconciliation. "Where will I go?" he asked finally. "That's not my problem to solve," I said. "You're an adult with a good income and professional connections. I'm sure you'll figure something out. Can't we at least discuss this more before making any permanent decisions?" "We've been discussing it for weeks, Kevin. The difference is that now you're finally being honest about what's been happening. I mean, really discuss it, with counseling or mediation or something." "To what end?" I repeated. "You've already demonstrated that you're willing to lie to me, cheat on me, and allow other people to disrespect me. What exactly would counseling accomplish?" Kevin looked like he was grasping for any argument that might delay the inevitable. "We've been together for 7 years, he said. "That has to count for something." "It does count for something," I agreed. "It counts as 7 years of my life that I invested in a relationship with someone who turned out to be fundamentally dishonest. I'm not fundamentally dishonest." "Kevin, you've been conducting an affair for months while lying to my face about your feelings and our future. You allowed your girlfriend to insult me publicly while pretending to be concerned about our marriage. Exactly what part of that behavior suggests fundamental honesty?" Kevin had no answer for that question, and his silence confirmed what we both knew to be true. "I'll pack some things tonight," he said finally, his voice defeated. "But I think you're making a mistake, Amanda. I think you're throwing away something that could still be saved." "I'm not throwing anything away," I replied. "I'm simply refusing to continue investing in something that you've already destroyed." Kevin nodded slowly, the fight going out of him as he fully absorbed the reality of what was happening. "For what it's worth," he said as he stood to leave the kitchen. "I am sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." "I believe you didn't want to." "Hurt me," I said. "But wanting and acting are two different things. Your actions over the past months have demonstrated very clearly what your priorities actually were." Kevin left the kitchen without another word, and I heard him climbing the stairs to our bedroom to gather his belongings. The sound of drawers opening and closing, of hangers scraping in the closet, created a strange soundtrack to the end of my marriage. I remained at the kitchen table, processing the conversation and the finality of what had just occurred. 7 years of marriage ended not with dramatic confrontation or tearful pleading, but with quiet acknowledgement that too much damage had been done for repair to be possible. My phone buzzed with a text from Nicole. "How did it go? Details, please." I typed back. "Executive review went perfectly. Stephanie was terminated for professional misconduct. Kevin is packing his things now." Her response came immediately. "Holy shit, you actually did it. You took them both down." "I documented professional misconduct and recommended appropriate action," I corrected. "The consequences were their own doing." Semantics. The result is the same. "How are you feeling?" I considered the question carefully. How was I feeling? Sad about the end of my marriage, certainly. Angry about the months of deception and disrespect. But underneath those emotions was something else. Something that felt like relief and renewed confidence in my own capabilities. "Free," I typed back. "I feel free." Nicole's next message included several celebration emojis and a promise to bring wine over the weekend to properly commemorate my victory. An hour later, Kevin appeared in the kitchen with 2 suitcases and a garment bag. His face was drawn and tired, but he seemed to have accepted the reality of the situation. "I've taken what I need for now," he said. "I'll arrange to get the rest of my things next week when you're at work." "That's fine," I replied. "Just coordinate the timing with me so I know when to expect movers." "Where should I leave my house key?" "On the kitchen counter is fine." Kevin set the key down with deliberate care, as if the simple action carried enormous significance. "Amanda," he said, pausing at the door that led to the garage. "I really am sorry about everything. I hope someday you can forgive me." "I already have forgiven you," I said, surprising both of us with the truth of the statement. "But forgiveness doesn't mean I'm willing to continue accepting behavior that's fundamentally disrespectful." Kevin nodded, seeming to understand the distinction. "Will you be okay? Financially, I mean? I know my income covered most of our expenses." "I'll be fine," I assured him. "My promotion at Sterling comes with a significant salary increase, and I've always been good at managing finances." "Right," Kevin said, though he seemed surprised by the reminder that my career had advanced substantially during the same period, that his personal life had imploded. "Take care of yourself, Kevin," I said, meaning it genuinely. "I hope you learned something from this experience." "I hope so too," he replied, then disappeared into the garage. I heard his car start and pull out of the driveway, carrying away the last physical remnant of our shared life. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been for months, free from the tension and unspoken conflict that had characterized our interactions for weeks. I walked through the room slowly, noting how different everything felt now that I was truly alone. The living room where we'd watched countless movies together. The dining room where we'd hosted dinner parties for friends and family. The home office where I'd planned my career while he'd planned his deception. All of it was mine now, to do with as I pleased without having to negotiate or compromise with someone whose priorities had proven to be fundamentally incompatible with my own. In the bedroom, I could see the empty spaces where Kevin's belongings had been. Half the closet was vacant, the dresser top cleared of his watch case and cologne bottles. The room felt larger somehow, as if it had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. I sat on the edge of the bed and reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in the span of 3 weeks. I had gone from being the ignored wife at a company party to being the senior marketing executive who had successfully identified and addressed a serious professional conduct issue. More importantly, I had discovered capabilities and confidence that I hadn't known I possessed. The woman who had been dismissed as the old model had proven to be far more contemporary and effective than the young secretary who had so arrogantly attempted to replace her. My phone rang, interrupting my reflections. The caller ID showed Richard Hamilton from Sterling Marketing Solutions. "Amanda," he said when I answered, "I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to personally thank you for your exceptional work on the Pacific Architecture Group assessment." "Thank you," I replied. "I'm pleased that the evaluation proved useful." "More than useful," Hamilton continued. Crawford called me this afternoon to express how impressed his team was with your professionalism and thoroughness. He specifically mentioned your ability to identify and address professional conduct issues that could have seriously damaged their client relationships. I'm glad we could help them maintain their professional standards, I said. Because of your excellent work on this project, I'd like to discuss expanding your responsibilities at Sterling, Hamilton continued. We have several other high-profile accounts that could benefit from your particular combination of strategic thinking and attention to professional excellence. I'd be very interested in hearing more about those opportunities, I replied, feeling a surge of professional satisfaction. Excellent. Let's schedule a meeting for Thursday to discuss your new role and the compensation adjustment that goes with it. After ending the call, I realized that while one chapter of my life was ending, another was beginning with unprecedented promise and potential. The skills I'd demonstrated in handling the Pacific Architecture Group situation had opened new doors that I hadn't even imagined a month ago. The woman who had been called the old model was about to become Sterling Marketing Solutions' newest senior partner, with a client portfolio and salary that reflected her true professional value. Sometimes the best revenge was simply refusing to be diminished by people who underestimated your capabilities. And sometimes, the most devastating response to disrespect was demonstrating exactly how much power and influence the supposedly outdated person actually possessed. Kevin and Stephanie had assumed that youth and arrogance would triumph over experience and strategic thinking. Instead, they had learned that professional competence and ethical behavior were far more valuable than superficial advantages. The house was quiet around me, but it was the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary rather than the tense silence of a relationship in crisis. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight I allowed myself to simply enjoy the satisfaction of having reclaimed my dignity and professional worth. The old model, it turned out, was actually a classic that had simply been waiting for the right opportunity to demonstrate its enduring value. And that opportunity had finally arrived. 3 months had passed since Kevin loaded his suitcases into his car and drove away from the life we'd built together. The autumn leaves that had been just beginning to turn were now long gone, replaced by the bare branches and crisp air of a Portland winter that felt full of possibility rather than loss. My new corner office at Sterling Marketing Solutions offered panoramic views of the city skyline, a visual reminder of how far I'd traveled from that humiliating evening at the company party. The nameplate on my desk read, Amanda Foster, Senior Partner, a title that still gave me a quiet thrill every time I saw it. The Pacific Architecture Group account had exceeded all expectations, transforming not just their brand presence, but their entire approach to client relations. Crawford's team had implemented every one of my recommendations, and the results spoke for themselves. Their business had grown by 30% in the quarter following our rebranding launch, with new clients specifically citing their professionalism and attention to detail as deciding factors. More importantly, for my personal satisfaction, the company had become a model for professional conduct standards in the architecture industry. Crawford had personally credited my assessment with helping them identify and address cultural issues that could have seriously damaged their reputation. The irony wasn't lost on me that Kevin's betrayal had inadvertently launched me into the most successful phase of my career. While he struggled to rebuild his professional standing after the scandal of his secretary's termination, I had become one of Portland's most sought-after marketing consultants. This morning brought a particularly satisfying development. Marcus, the receptionist from Pacific Architecture Group, had called to schedule a meeting between Crawford and myself to discuss expanding our partnership. Apparently, they wanted Sterling to handle marketing for their new Seattle and San Francisco offices, a contract worth over $3 million annually. Amanda, Richard Hamilton said, appearing in my office doorway with his usual expression of professional satisfaction. Do you have a moment to discuss the Morrison Industries proposal? I gestured to the seating area by my windows, where we often held informal strategy sessions. Hamilton had become not just my employer, but a genuine mentor, someone who recognized and rewarded professional excellence without the personal complications that had characterized my marriage. "I've reviewed your preliminary assessment," he continued, settling into one of the leather chairs. "Your approach to their brand repositioning is exactly what they need. Bold, innovative, but grounded in solid strategic thinking." "Thank you," I replied. "Morrison Industries has tremendous potential, but they've been trapped by outdated thinking about their market position." Hamilton smiled. "Sounds familiar. You seem to have a particular talent for helping organizations move beyond limiting perspectives." The comment was a subtle reference to my work with Pacific Architecture Group, where I'd successfully transformed both their brand strategy and their internal culture. It had become something of a signature capability, this ability to identify and address underlying issues that other consultants missed. "Speaking of moving beyond limitations," Hamilton continued, "I wanted to discuss something that might interest you. I've been approached by several other marketing firms about the possibility of joining Sterling through acquisition or partnership." I raised an eyebrow. "Expansion plans?" "More than that," Hamilton said, his expression growing more serious. "I'm considering stepping back from day-to-day operations within the next 2 years. I want to focus on strategic development and industry relationships while transitioning operational leadership to someone with fresh perspectives and proven capabilities." The implication was clear, though he didn't state it directly. He was evaluating me as a potential successor, someone who could lead Sterling Marketing Solutions into its next phase of growth. "That's an exciting vision," I said carefully. "What kind of timeline are you considering?" 18 months for a gradual transition, with full leadership transfer by the end of next year," Hamilton replied. "The board would need to approve any succession plan, of course, but your performance over the past quarter has been exceptional." We discussed the possibilities for another 30 minutes, covering everything from client development strategies to staff expansion plans. By the time Hamilton left my office, I had a clear understanding that my professional future held opportunities I hadn't even imagined 6 months earlier. My phone buzzed with a text from Nicole as I was reviewing the Morrison Industries files. "Lunch today? I have gossip about your former coworkers." I smiled, typing back quickly. "Blue Moon Cafe at noon?" I could use some entertainment. Nicole had become an invaluable source of information about how Kevin and Stephanie were adjusting to their new circumstances. Her law firm handled employment, matters for several companies in Portland's architecture and design community, which meant she often heard industry gossip before it became widely known. The Blue Moon Cafe was busy with the lunch crowd when I arrived, but Nicole had secured our usual table in the corner where we could talk without being overheard. She was already studying the menu with the focused attention she brought to everything, from legal briefs to restaurant selections. "You look fantastic," she said, glancing up as I approached. "Success suits you." "Thank you," I replied, settling into the chair across from her. "You mentioned gossip?" Nicole's eyes lit up with the expression she wore when she had particularly juicy information to share. "Multiple sources," she began, leaning forward conspiratorially. "First, Kevin's situation at Pacific Architecture Group has become increasingly complicated." "How so?" "Apparently, Crawford and his team have been questioning his judgment ever since the Stephanie Blake incident. Having your direct report terminated for professional misconduct doesn't exactly enhance your reputation for leadership." I nodded, unsurprised by this development. "Any specific consequences?" "He's been passed over for 2 major project assignments that he was expecting to receive," Nicole continued. "Word is that Crawford doesn't trust his client relationship management capabilities." "And Stephanie?" Nicole's smile became predatory. "Oh, that's the best part. She's been trying to find another position in the industry for 3 months. But news of her termination has spread. Apparently, being fired for insulting a client representative is the kind of reputation that follows you. That's unfortunate, I said, though I felt little genuine sympathy for someone who had so thoroughly earned her professional difficulties. It gets better, Nicole continued. She finally found a position with a small residential design firm in Beaverton, but it's a significant step down in both salary and responsibilities. Entry-level administrative work, basically. The information was satisfying in a way that I didn't entirely want to examine. Stephanie had assumed that her youth and attractiveness would always provide professional advantages, but she was discovering that competence and character mattered more than superficial qualities. "What about Kevin?" I asked. "Still employed. But his trajectory has definitely stalled," Nicole replied. "I heard through professional channels that he's been considering looking for opportunities outside Portland, possibly a fresh start somewhere his reputation hasn't been damaged." "That might be wise," I agreed. "Sometimes geographic distance is the only way to escape the consequences of poor judgment." We ordered our meals and spent the rest of lunch discussing my expanding role at Sterling and Nicole's own career developments. She had recently been promoted to senior associate at her firm, and we were both enjoying the satisfaction of professional advancement built on merit rather than manipulation. As we prepared to leave, Nicole reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You know," she said, "I'm proud of you for how you handled everything. A lot of people would have just accepted the situation or made a messy scene, but you found a way to hold everyone accountable while advancing your own interests." "I just refuse to be diminished by people who underestimated me," I replied. The rest followed naturally. "The rest followed because you're smarter and more strategic than they gave you credit for," Nicole corrected. Stephanie Blake learned that calling someone the old model can be a very expensive mistake. That evening, I returned home to my quiet house in the Riverside district, a space that had been transformed from a source of tension into a genuine sanctuary. The rooms that had once felt heavy with unspoken conflict now reflected my personal taste and priorities, decorated with artwork I loved, and furniture that served my needs rather than someone else's preferences. The kitchen, where Kevin and I had shared countless meals and conversations, had become my favorite room. I'd renovated it completely, adding granite countertops and modern appliances that made cooking a pleasure rather than a chore. Tonight, I was preparing dinner for one, a simple but elegant meal that I could enjoy while reviewing the Morrison Industries proposal. As I worked, my phone rang with a call from an unknown local number. I hesitated before answering, but curiosity won. Hello? Amanda, it's Kevin." The sound of his voice after 3 months of silence was jarring, though not as emotionally charged as I might have expected. Time and professional success had created distance from the pain of his betrayal, leaving me able to respond with calm detachment. "Hello, Kevin. How are you?" "I'm well," he said, though there was strain in his voice that suggested otherwise. "I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from Nicole." That was interesting. Nicole hadn't mentioned giving Kevin my contact information, which meant he'd probably contacted her law firm under some professional pretext. "What can I do for you?" I asked, my tone neutral. "I wanted to talk to you," Kevin said. "About us, about what happened. I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past few months." "I see. And what conclusions have you reached?" "That I made terrible mistakes," Kevin said. "That I threw away the best thing in my life because I was selfish and stupid and scared." The words had the sound of a prepared speech, something he'd rehearsed multiple times before working up the courage to make the call. "I appreciate you acknowledging that," I replied, "but I'm not sure what you expect me to do with that information." "I was hoping we could meet," Kevin continued. "Just to talk, to see if there's any possibility of working things out." The request didn't surprise me, though the timing was interesting. 3 months of professional difficulties and social isolation had apparently given Kevin time to reconsider his priorities. "Kevin," I said gently, Our marriage is over. We've both moved on with our lives. Have we? I mean, I know you've been incredibly successful at Sterling, and I'm proud of you for that. But have you really moved on, or are you just keeping busy to avoid dealing with what we lost? It was a reasonable question, one that I'd asked myself during quiet moments over the past months. I've moved on, I said with certainty. I've discovered capabilities and confidence that I never would have found if I'd remained in a relationship where I was taken for granted. You were never taken for granted, Kevin protested. Kevin, you conducted an affair for months while allowing your girlfriend to insult me publicly. If that's not taking someone for granted, I don't know what is. I know, he said quickly. I know how it looked, and I know how wrong it was. But I never stopped loving you, Amanda. I just got confused about what I wanted. And now you're not confused anymore? Now I understand what I lost, Kevin said. And I understand that Stephanie was never really a threat to our marriage. She was just a distraction from problems that we should have addressed together. It was a more mature perspective than I'd expected from him, but it came too late to matter. I'm glad you've gained that insight, I said. But that doesn't change. The fundamental fact that you chose to handle our marital problems by lying to me and pursuing someone else. People make mistakes, Amanda. Marriage is supposed to be about forgiveness and second chances. Some mistakes are too fundamental to forgive, I replied. Some choices reveal character flaws that make future trust impossible. Kevin was quiet for a long moment. So there's no chance? No possibility that we could try again? No, I said firmly. There isn't. Because of what I did or because you've found someone else? The question surprised me with its directness. Because I've found myself, I replied. I've discovered that I'm capable of far more than I realized when I was focused on maintaining a relationship with someone who didn't value what I brought to it. I did value you, Kevin insisted. Kevin, if you had valued me, you wouldn't have allowed Stephanie to treat me the way she did. You wouldn't have conducted an affair while lying to my face about your feelings for our marriage. I was confused. You were selfish, I corrected. There's a difference. Kevin sighed, the sound carrying 3 months of regret and frustration. What if I could prove that I've changed? He asked. What if I could show you that I understand what I did wrong and that I'm committed to being the husband you deserve? It's too late for that, I said. I'm not the same person I was when our marriage ended, and I don't want to be. I've built a life that reflects my priorities and capabilities, and that life doesn't include space for someone who's already demonstrated their unreliability. So you're saying there's nothing I can do? I'm saying that the best thing you can do is learn from this experience and treat your next relationship with the honesty and respect that you failed to show me. But there won't be a next relationship, Kevin said. I'm not interested in anyone else. That's your choice, I replied. But it doesn't change my decision. We talked for a few more minutes, with Kevin making increasingly desperate appeals for reconsideration and me maintaining polite but firm boundaries. Finally, he seemed to accept that the conversation wasn't going to produce the outcome he'd hoped for. I guess that's it then, he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. I guess it is, I agreed. Take care of yourself, Kevin. I genuinely hope you find happiness. I hope you do too, he replied, though his tone suggested he doubted that was possible without him. After ending the call, I returned to my dinner preparation with a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. Kevin's attempt at reconciliation had confirmed what I'd suspected, that his regret was motivated more by loneliness and professional difficulties than by genuine understanding of what he'd destroyed. More importantly, his call had crystallized my own understanding of how completely I'd moved beyond our relationship. The woman who had been dismissed as the old model had evolved into someone far more capable and confident than either Kevin or Stephanie had imagined possible. My phone buzzed with a text from Hamilton. Morrison Industries meeting moved to tomorrow at 10 a.m. They're ready to move forward with the full proposal. I smiled, setting the phone aside as I finished preparing my meal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, as would the weeks and months ahead. But tonight, I allowed myself to simply enjoy the peaceful satisfaction of a life rebuilt on my own terms. The old model, it turned out, had been a classic all along, just waiting for the right circumstances to demonstrate its enduring value and timeless appeal. And those circumstances had finally arrived, bringing with them a future that was brighter and more promising than anything I could have imagined when I first walked into that company party and discovered how little my husband and his secretary thought of me. Sometimes the best revenge was simply proving wrong everyone who had underestimated your worth. And sometimes, the most devastating response to disrespect was building a life so successful and satisfying that the people who had dismissed you became irrelevant to your happiness. Stephanie Blake had called me the old model and suggested that Kevin needed someone more contemporary. Instead, she had discovered that experience, intelligence, and strategic thinking were far more valuable than youth and misplaced confidence. The contemporary woman, it turned out, was the one who refused to be diminished by others' limited vision of her potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.